Okay, let's get started to make sure we are on time. So welcome back. Yeah, on day 2, it was exciting first day. So really great to see everything starting to glue together from research, education, and knowledge transfer. Really a great moment. So today we're going to get started with a summary of the focus group. So we had 3 different sessions, and then that will be followed by a DEI presentation by Courtney. Okay, thanks. Welcome, Pierre.
Hello, I'm Jerry again. I led the focus group for parameterization, and to summarize the problems, find the problem. We have subgroup scales, and we need to find a way to create shortcuts for those processes that are in those scales. Typically, they require a lot of compute power, but we can get good approximations with machine learning potentially. And we also have prioritizations for processes that we don't have governing laws for, in which case more computational power won't help at all. So some of the problems we want to address, besides the main problem, is minimizing the amount of time it takes to get acquainted with jargon. So we have a lot of people going from different backgrounds, from math, engineering, and physics, and they all need to be onboarded to the same type of domain, and minimizing that onboarding time is critical. Second is expanding access to high resolution process data sets. Just to get started, you need to have a toy problem to work with, and making sure the spin up to that toy problem is minimized is great. If you want to foster collaboration, then stuff like 2I2C, Pangea is awesome. Gets an essential skill as well. Critically, one of the biggest problems associated with parameterization is making sure any improvement in offline skill translates to online skill, because that tends to be an intractable problem if you're not plugging into parameterizations online. On that note, to go from offline to online, typically you need to go from a Python model to something that works in Fortran, and there are ways to do this with the Fortran Keras bridge or PyTorch binding, but they have their shortcomings, and finding ways to improve them would speed things considerably. Lastly, on shared problems, we have separate focus groups. We all have similar problems, and finding ways to identify those shared problems so we aren't siloed is an important next step. So to address these problems, what kind of training do you want to see? Fortran training, I'm biased towards this. I definitely would benefit from much Fortran training. I don't think this is taught in any undergrad courses that I'm aware of, and it's sort of a thing you just teach yourself, even though it's like quite antiquated and there's not a lot of documentation online. So having a sort of formal setup for this would be very helpful. Advanced Git training. This is something that people learn themselves a lot, especially if they're doing like professional software engineering internships. But if we want to collaborate professionally across campuses and not have to send code back and forth, making sure we can collaborate on Git in a really efficient way is really helpful. On a similar note, making sure we can communicate with code in a way that doesn't break when we're transferring, when we're working different systems or different packages is really helpful. And to do that, we'd probably want to have container training, particularly with Docker or Singularity. And Geo2I2C, we had some of this at Leap already, and more of that would be useful. Lastly, you have soft skills, which are also not quite taught. You sort of learn yourself. Project management, communication, interpersonal skills. And if you yourself have a topic that you think you've taken a lot of time to master and you think would be helpful for others, then volunteering to host a workshop would be very much appreciated. So what lessons we learned from our short discussion? The tradition in academia is to really publish your successes in the form of papers and show, like, I guess, the end result of a lot of trials and failure. But if we want to, I guess, help each other out, then being open and transparent about failures is critical, because that means that a lot of people don't have to solve the same failure to get to the point that you are at. On a similar note, if you have an interaction that's positive, it's important to take some time to reflect and try to emulate it for yourself. And that doesn't have to be the form of, like, say, a one-to-one interaction. It can be a presentation or a paper, or just some writing you found very concise and easy to understand. Another part of this is to not be afraid of dumb questions. Everyone has dumb questions starting out, and sometimes people have dumb questions later in their career. And it always takes more time to figure them out yourself and just ask them. So yeah, just ask and get it over with. Lastly, for lessons learned, we're all learning new tools, but these tools aren't immortal. Eventually, there will be another programming language or another set of tools we need to learn. So don't commit and pretend that's going to be the end all be all. You will have to retool. Many people have retooled multiple times. So be comfortable with the core concepts and be willing to reinvent yourself to learn what you need to learn. Next steps. So for immediate next steps, we want a shared data set that climate scientists and computer scientists can collaborate on freely with the least friction possible. That means something that is already pre-processed, has a lot of documentation, comments, and whatnot. Preferably using GitHub and having data on the cloud. We want more defined roles within the focus group so that people feel more involved, especially if they're not at Columbia. It's hard to feel like you're, I guess, really involved if you're not physically on campus. So that'd be very helpful. Creating a shared GitHub with frequent workflows. If you think you've nailed down a certain workload and it's impeccable, then sharing it with others would be useful. And we could have a GitHub that centralizes all of these workflows. And lastly, this is a bit ambitious, but maybe having a Kaggle style competition where there's a shared data set and a hidden test set, and everyone submits their models for ranking. And that's it. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Yang. I'm a lead postdoc. We're doing the parameter estimation group. So the goals is to, introduce and discuss different parameter estimation methods, promote collaborations, and in the long term, and also I think learn from each other. So the focus of our previous discussions are about more about methods. Less collaboration related. So it's about things that you don't get to see on the papers. For example, like the limitation of difficulty of implementing certain methods, and like your personal views and experience or feeling about certain method. So we have 24 groups, 3 discussions in the last 3 months, and normally the attendees range from 7 to 12. So here are the topics, Bayesian statistics and ensemble common filter. So just to give you an example of what we have discussed, we want to see the things you don't see, like I said earlier. So we go with the simplest method, which is common filter, and then we introduce ensemble common filter, and then how it is adapted in a paper. So you can see an example slide here. So we try to mark the connection, which is the thing that, sometimes they use just one sentence in the paper. And the discussion points we have had includes sometimes the details in the paper, sometimes a clarification of a concept, and etc. So for the discussion from yesterday, it seems like there's a common challenge that we all face, which is to build the emulator. So what it does, so the emulator basically predicts the output of complicated numerical models based on a relatively small data set. So it's not really a big data problem, but I think it's critical because we need to deal with uncertainty and etc. So that seems to be a common problem. And also, like more specifically, it's like, how do we sample the parameters to run the models such that we could have more valuable input and output for training the emulator? And it seems it's like kind of universal. And that gap perhaps we can fill in is that, so to strengthen the collaboration between different communities, seems like we need to describe a problem or challenge in a format that is, understandable to different communities, or sometimes we should kind of simplify the context and all that. And also, the data set that can be shared are like, it's actually very doable and can be done fairly soon. We can have synthesized data sets from different kinds of models with different levels of complexity. So the other challenges are listed here as well. So the focus group for this year, so we want to have more discussion for sure, build collaborations, but also we don't want to burden the participants too much. And format-wise, we have done like method introduction and discussion. Perhaps we can try to focus on discussing the challenges that have been listed in the previous slide. And definitely we want to have more students participating, like take some more responsibilities. And that's a good training process, I think. And also our discussion in the last year is kind of sometimes goes from like very detailed stuff to like very broad thingy. But I think both of them are like very beneficial to us researchers. And another important point for me is to better record and track the things we have been discussed. And that's it. Well, you're welcome to join. Yeah, thanks.
For you who don't know me, I'm Thea Heimdal. I'm a postdoc I'm in Qingyuan. So I have been so lucky that I've gotten to organize the focus group this fall. And I want to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we've been up to. Okay, so officially we're 16 members and we meet every 3 weeks, about once a month. And we have hybrid meetings, so both on Zoom. And for those who want to, they can meet up in person at the Sleep Space. We have a broad range of backgrounds in our group in terms of career stages and our research focus. We have PhD students, postdocs, and professors. And I was looking up yesterday all of our research interests. It's very broad. It ranges from everything from clouds, precipitation, or ocean carbon cycle, ecosystem biogeochemistry, vegetation dynamics, ice physics, land-atmosphere interactions. And this makes this into a really interesting group, but it can also make it challenging to find common goals. So during our first focus group meeting, I asked everyone, what are your expectations? What do we want to get out of this group? And these were overall people's answers. So to build a community and network within LEAP, to share code and workflows that can cut across disciplines, to have interactive conversations, to have a place where it's safe to ask questions and learn, to improve communication between the observation and modeling communities, and also to evaluate models, observations, and uncertainties. And hopefully in the future, we will be able to address all of this. So what have we done so far? Most importantly, we have gotten to know each other. Our group meetings don't have a set format, so our group meetings have been quite different from time to time. We have all had individual presentations of our projects to show what we're working on, what kind of problems we're facing, what our goals are. And we have also had a session where we had a discussion on a topic that we selected, and in this case, it was uncertainties. And most importantly, we have come up with a lot of questions. So future plans, we have been thinking about trying to identify specific research challenges that for all of us that are working on different things, and to see, do any of these challenges overlap? And if they do, Would it be possible perhaps to define some sort of template, maybe a Jupyter notebook, and how to solve this specific problem? And then everyone can have access to this notebook. Just an idea we have. And in order maybe to do so, we were thinking about maybe trying to collaborate with more data scientists. We don't have so many of them in our group. We've also briefly discussed maybe the possibility of can we write a review paper together as a group. So going forward, we have many questions. How do you define uncertainties? How do you evaluate your machine learning models? How do you measure model improvements? How do you choose the right metrics? If you have multiple data sets or observations, how do you know which one to choose? And what do we do if the observational errors are poor or unknown? And if you have an answer to any of these questions, please join our group. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there seems to be a lot of shared feeling around the value of these problems, and I feel like we had laid plans for hackathons, and a bottleneck is just getting them ready. And like, I find the idea of like for a quarter having the focus groups like work together on getting them ready really interesting. There's like at least 3 data sets that I'm aware of that on the microphysics side that are ready to upload, on the superparameterization side, and on the parameter inversion for the NASA GISS tuning that are ready to go, where the metrics are clear. But it's a lot of work, and it could be fun to distribute and also serve a training need to spend a month or 2 doing that work together through the focus groups.
Sorry, just very quickly to respond to that. Having sat in most of the focus groups, I mean, I think that's what everyone wanted to do. I mean, to your point, Robert, I mean, I think that the question is very much like what Tian said, is what do we define as a toy problem, you know? And actually, a few weeks back, you know, we had Stefan Rasp actually presenting in the Journal Club, and he said, I think he made a very good case, which is that it should be something that will be useful down the road, right? So if it's too simple, that's great to get some understanding. Will that be useful in terms of the algorithmic development? Potentially not, right? So it has to be to strike the right balance, right? And I think that's potentially something. Yeah, so just to be clear. Yes. Exactly, you're right. Education, yeah.
It's like walking; these two are not competing in a way, right? So you want to get this thing to be useful for the research, but if you don't train people to get familiar with machine learning, you know, what I found is that I cannot define those hackathons. I don't know the science enough to define it, but I need to work with someone who has the domain knowledge to collaborate. I can find master students to help cleaning data, you know, get them started code ready, but somebody need to tell them what is good and what is bad. But I can collab with Bob, but he said, I don't know machine learning enough to tell you whether it's good or bad or not. Like, so we need to do the education one, which is left foot up forward, and then eventually the research goes. Like, so nothing is too simple to get started with. And if it's so easy, that we get it done very quickly and we're ready to move to the next one. So that's why I said, so I feel the sweet spot of a toy example is a moving target, and we may never be able to define it. And so to get started and to and then get back to the first one is allow some of our effort to fail is also a good experience.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that in past workshops, actually a few participants here went to the Aspen Global Change Institute workshop over summer, and the toy model problem came up as well. So this is like even beyond LEAP, it seems to be a really big community need, but I really want to emphasize that it seems like there could be a use case for data sets, but then the toy model from a physics standpoint is different, right? Because we can train some sort of parameterization emulator offline. And then when we put that back into a model, that's where some issues can arise. And so my thinking, at least something that I would love to have to play with, is some simpler sort of physical model that I can train parameterizations or other processes offline and then test to see whether they remain stable online or in further development. So if that makes sense, right? So it just seems like there's a difference between a data set toy problem and then a physical model toy problem. And
if I may, just to what has been said, especially Tian and Robert, I mean, to some extent, it's not too far from what we are seeing also in the climate community, this idea of model hierarchy, right? I mean, that's pretty much how we would want to approach that, something that's approachable so that we could actually understand things. Actually, Galen and you have a class actually on, so that would be a very nice entry point as well, like on simpler model to understand the physics, things like that.
I'll be really quick, just to reply to Maria. Big +1 on the toy models in the M² lines project. We've had a lot of success with QG models, quasi-catastrophic reduced order, but still turbulent simulations. We have a nice Python code called PyQG that you can just run on your laptop, and it allows you to play with things like, putting the parameterization online. Is it still stable? Like these questions. So that can be an important part of that. We're very happy to collaborate with people on that. On the data point, just responding to what Mike said, especially as we're figuring out how to do this, there is a lot of work involved in creating a good benchmark data set and sharing it in a way that's accessible to people. Hopefully that'll get easier over time. But I want to note something that Rob said yesterday. This is a question about incentives. Like what we hear often is, well, we'd like to make a benchmark data set, but my postdoc really needs to focus on getting their next paper out. Like they don't have a few months to spend really fine-tuning this data set and publishing it. And as a center, I think we need to find ways to resist that culture, and that's really on the PIs to prioritize this work and give people the space to work on those things. But also, we have budget for this. Like Julius and I are focused on this problem. So if you have a data set that you think will be useful, you don't have the time or the expertise to really make it accessible, reach out to us and we will help you. We'll get it online. And Stefan Rasp had a huge impact by doing all that climate bench stuff, and we can do things like that. So reach out.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, we also have additional resources if it's a matter of like improving your data or improving your model, so it can actually make it could make it more widely available and useful. So we can actually leverage and support that as well from additional resources as well. So please reach out in that case. Thanks everyone. Great discussion. So we went a little bit over time. Sorry for Courtney. Yeah, we have
just real fast. I want to mention in ML, building data sets is valued a lot, and so that's a great way to get citations and be known. It's just building those data sets. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. And I'm joined by Dr. Christian Braneon, who will come up as well. We'll get started. Is this work? Okay, so to introduce myself, many of you already know me, but just to give you some background, I describe myself as a transdisciplinary social scientist, and in part because I have been trained in and work across multiple areas and disciplines, including psychology, social work, and population health, as well as computational social science. My work focuses on the characterization and measurement of racism, and I also think about the ways in which racism affects health and contributes to racial inequities in health. I do work in virtual reality, other emerging technologies, and think about social justice very broadly, as well as curriculum and pedagogy. I also work in corporate DEI and anti-racist practice, particularly with senior leaders. So all of that comes to bear on my work in this role, helping to lead DEI here at LEAP. And I also lead DEI at our Data Science Institute at Columbia as well. I'll turn it over to Christian to introduce himself.
Hey, good morning. I think I know some of you folks here. My name is Christian Braneon. I'm a climate scientist and a civil engineer. So both a researcher and a practitioner. My training is in environmental fluid mechanics and hydrology. And after that training, I went on and worked for a civil engineering firm doing water resources planning and water resources engineering. I spent 5 years at NASA GISS in the climate impacts group, doing research with satellite data and with global climate model outputs, helping folks around the world use those data sets for climate adaptation. And now I still do work in climate impacts, adaptation, resilience, but also doing work around carbon management as well. So really pleased to be here.
Yeah, so we just wanted to give you a sense of what informs our work and what informs our remarks and comments today. As I indicated in the title for this session, the goal is to provide some context to, from my perspective, push and may disrupt the way that you think about issues related to DEI. This is not a training session. We're not going to do anything related to unconscious bias. I'll explain why that would not be useful in just a moment. And then we will turn to Christian, who will share some of the ways in which DEI, anti-racism, has intersected with his work in climate over the course of his career, using a few examples to make it more concrete. This is all leading up to a session in part 2 where we'll do strategic planning. So we'll have you work in very concrete ways around what your commitments, goals, and actions are related to DEI and anti-racism in particular. So I appreciate your attention, as we've all agreed to not look at our computers while we're engaged in this session, and look forward to the discussion. So like I said, I'll first give an overview of DEI at LEAP, offer some food for thought and critical reflections. I'll turn it over to Christian. Sorry, I forgot that I'll also give you some brief best practices, and then we'll open it up for discussion. To help set us up for the strategic planning session, we'll also do an exercise where we're thinking together what our specific spheres of influence are. So given the roles that you occupy professionally in different organizations, having you reflect on your different spheres of influence, and then we'll go into part 2 after the break. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I think we're all familiar. I'm not here to convince you that DEI matters for climate science and climate adaptation. Most of us know that there are particular groups of people who are suffering more harms at the hands of climate change, that are deeply rooted in structural racism and other structural inequities. So living in communities with more concrete as opposed to more trees, where are pollutants dumped, where are buses parked, et cetera, and how that gets organized around race and socioeconomic status that makes particular communities more vulnerable to the effects of climate change, in addition to the resources to respond to those threats. So we're in the broadening participation, knowledge transfer space. As I indicated in my remarks about knowledge transfer, education, and DEI all intersect. We're really thinking about DEI as being integrated throughout the work of LEAP, not as a separate entity that does DEI stuff on the side. So it's really important for us to think about LEAP's vision in related to DEI's related to recruitment, research, education, and knowledge transfer. We're focused on increasing representation of underrepresented minorities in this burgeoning discipline. And we also are committed to assessing, reviewing, and revising our activities related to this explicitly through a DEI lens. So we're thinking about DEI in everything. So knowledge transfer, education, everything that was talked about related to those activities are filtered through a lens of DEI. Our executive committee has a shared commitment to moving the needle on these issues. And so we have been having our own discussions leading up to this event and are continuing to engage. Even the ethos of open science and transdisciplinarity is also connected to broadening participation in DEI. Those things are related to the concepts that we talk about in DEI as well. Of course, we think about it as it relates to our recruitment and hiring, as well as our retention efforts. But we're also really trying to integrate it, as I said, into our center and lab cultures and climate. So not seeing the DEI acronym doesn't mean that it's not being implemented. It's in everything, and that should be the assumption. So what are we focused on? We're focused on DEI as a holistic lens and practice. We're thinking about DEI that's anti-racist and anti-oppressive. I'll explain what I mean by that in just a moment. Supporting integration of DEI into your science and research. Developing yourself and social competency. How do you understand yourself as a person engaged in science, as a person engaged in social impact, as a person engaged in DEI work, as well as your understanding of how these issues manifest in society in ways that are just generally implicated in the things that we think about in terms of social inequalities, but also in ways that have implications for both climate adaptation and your work. We will focus on strategic planning, development, implementation, and accountability, and also thinking about ways to offer ongoing support for your decision-making, problem-solving, and strategy building. And then thinking about how we have influence beyond what we're doing here at LEAP. So committed to documenting and disseminating what we're learning here so that other people can benefit from what we're doing. I just wanted to highlight, sometimes people use this acronym of JEDI. We've used it on occasion as well. Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, just to make a distinction about what those different components mean. They're not the same thing. So justice would think about repairing past harms. Equity would think about systems, outputs that prevent future harm. Diversity is really about recruitment and representation, and inclusion, we're thinking about culture, climate, et cetera. So what do I mean by anti-racism? Thinking about anticipating and preemptively avoiding racial inequities in systems and in our behaviors. And what I mean by racial inequities is that anytime we observe a pattern by race, we're dealing with the racial inequity, right? We're observing a pattern at a population level or that's repeating over periods of time. We would think that that's not due to the group itself. There's probably something else underlying that and would frame that as an inequity. Anti-oppression is just a broader frame, thinking about anticipating and responding to social, cultural, and interpersonal barriers to access based on social positionality. So why do we have this emphasis on race? So one, there's a general lack of competence and a resistance to having that incompetence corrected related to issues of race and racism. There's a pretty broad psychological literature that documents people in the United States in particular underestimate racial inequities across a number of social metrics and resist data that attempts to correct their misunderstandings. And so given that, there's a need to emphasize and dissect race and racism specifically. Also, when we're thinking about earth sciences and geosciences, we know that you have over 4 decades of data indicating a severe lack of representation along the lines of race and retention, and no progress whatsoever on that particular indicator for about 40 years. And so given the data suggesting that this is a sticking point in the disciplines that intersect with LEAP, it makes sense to think about this as a specific challenge that we need to address. We also know that colorblind and race-neutral DEI approaches are not effective. When you know that when we think about DEI as a generic undertaking, we tend to see more progress for women, white women in particular, and we're less successful with other groups when we're not thinking about them specifically in our efforts. And in the landscape of social inequity and oppression, racism is an anchor that intersects with and exacerbates all other inequities. Anytime you introduce race into a model that's trying to document social inequity, the worst outcomes are for groups that represent particular racial positionalities. And so we know that that changes the likelihood of progress, the likelihood of access, et cetera, significantly. So it's important for us to think about it as a distinct phenomenon. What we're not focused on is training. We're not focused on unconscious bias, and we're not focused on convincing you that DEI matters. You're a part of LEAP, and it's assumed that you're on board with this as being central to the work of understanding climate adaptation and addressing the climate crisis. So I wanted you to know that there are several resources. I'll share these slides in the Slack channel so that you have all the links. We've been developing a list of resources, reading ways in which you can engage on your own around best practices related to recruitment, lab cultures and climate, et cetera. I encourage you to take it upon yourself and have some agency in consulting these resources. In addition to general kind of empirical and think pieces related to these issues, specifically related to climate. We'll engage in the strategic planning and development process in part 2. And we also have DEI office hours, which are on Thursday. I'll send all of this information out and remind you. But the way that I would suggest you use this is, or how people have used it in the past, is you have a question about recruiting. Where should you go to try and diversify your pool of candidates? How might you write your job description differently to try and maximize attention from a more diverse pool of candidates. There might be particular issues that are coming up in your work, even in terms of your service that's happening at the university, that I might be able to support, and I'm happy to do that. We're also in the process of developing a code of conduct, and as Pierre mentioned on day one, issues related to conduct and ethics, issues that might be coming up in your lab, things that you would like to discuss related to climate in your lab. I am definitely your point of contact for having those conversations, and happy to support you there as well. Based on your initial survey input, thank you to those of you who completed that, who were basically wrangled into completing it on the bus. Small group discussions and speaker series also seem to be of interest, and I'll talk about that in just a moment as well. So just an overview of your initial responses. We have 21 responses as of Sunday. Was it Monday? I'm sorry, I'm losing track of days. Yeah. So you talked about, I asked you to think about representation by race and gender in your disciplines. Most of you identified that your disciplines are predominantly white and or Asian. There are multiple references by you that there are 0 or very few Black people in your areas of study. There seem to be more gender parity, but it's clearly still an issue that representation, but in particular, the experiences that women are having once they're in these spaces are not always great. And some of you have an understanding of why we're observing those patterns, and some of you do not. You self-identified yourselves as having pretty strong competencies in racism, sexism, and DEI in society generally. Your self-identified growth points were around ableism and integrating DEI into your research. So how are ways that you can engage? So we're again starting off with what's happening at LEAP in general. Consult this digital resource that we've been developing. Come to DEI office hours and seek support. Our Futurist Science group who presented, this is a concrete way for you to engage in social impact that intersects with both DEI and knowledge transfer. I know with some of you, there's a struggle at times to really understand how your work on ice particles and clouds has implications for social impact, and it does. And I look forward to having those conversations more. But this is an immediate way for you to engage and have impact. If you say this is important to you and is valuable to you, here's a way through LEAP to stay engaged. Some of the themes that I'm thinking about related to small group discussions are ways in which you can connect DEI and anti-racism and social impact to your research, ethical community engagement, further development around your strategic planning, and thinking about your identity and positionality as it relates to your science. So who you are and how you think about yourself as a person, but also how you walk through the world, your positionality, and how that has implications for the work that you do. And then also further support to help you complete and implement your strategic plan. So hamster wheel, I'd like us to get off of it. We are stuck in this space of not seeing progress related to DEI, especially around race and other markers. And so what do we have to do? Why is it so hard to be diverse and equitable and inclusive? Why does that require so much time, resources, and money? Why is that not naturally occurring? And I think this is an important point for us to consider. As a shortcut before I offer some food for thought, I will assume that you don't believe that we have a DEI problem because some social groups by race or gender or what have you are just inherently smarter, work harder than other social groups. That would be pretty racist for that to be the assumption that you're making. So if that's not true, if there are inherent differences in particular groups of people, women, Black people, et cetera, what else is going on that's producing these patterns that we're observing in our disciplines and in STEM? What is getting in the way of increased representation? I'll also assume that you're aware that STEM disciplines in general and geo-earth sciences in particular have a clear and stagnant race problem in particular. That you believe DEI matters in society and science and at LEAP, and that you'd also like to get off of this hamster wheel, that you'd like to see some progress. If these assumptions are inconsistent with your beliefs, I'd love to have a chat with you. So food for thought, things for you to think about. We won't discuss these things necessarily directly, but we'll come to a discussion at the end following Christian's remarks. So we have to first believe that change is possible. You can't fix or meaningfully engage problems you don't understand, that you aren't willing to name, define, or defend. Implicit bias is not particularly useful as a point of intervention. So Greenwald, who was one of the three creators of the implicit attitudes task, which is many of you may have taken, you indicated on the survey that you've taken this, it tells you how biased you are unconsciously. Based on the millions of data points at this point that we have related to IAT data, we know that implicit bias is pervasive. We know that it shapes behavior and decision-making, but there's not any convincing empirical evidence that being aware of your bias actually shifts your behavior or that we can meaningfully reduce your bias over time. It's not the place to invest our time and resources. It's a bit of a Sisyphean task, pushing a boulder up a hill and it's rolling back down. What created the bias in the first place? What are the beliefs that underlie those biases are a more important thing for us to consider and think about. Greenwald said, I see most implicit bias training as window dressing that looks good both internally to an organization and externally, as if you're concerned in trying to do something. But it can be deployed without achieving anything, which makes it, in fact, counterproductive. After 10 years of doing this stuff and nobody reporting data, I think the logical conclusion is that if it was working, we would have heard about it. It's not. We're not reducing bias in meaningful ways that last over time, in spite of our spending millions of dollars related to implicit bias training. Another thing that gets in the way is system justification. So there's a tendency to uphold the status quo because it's more comfortable. The prioritization of comfort, order, and stability influences resistance to change and alternatives, especially if you're a member of the group that's not experiencing the brunt of oppression and threat. When we realize change is hard, particularly but not exclusively those in dominant positions, we're likely to frame the status quo as good enough, legitimate, and even desirable. We have enough women, we're good. We have enough Black people, that's fine. Or we really tried, we haven't seen any progress. We might as well just keep focusing on our work and not dedicating any more time to that. We're clearly not going to move the needle. So what do we know that does work? So discrimination elimination. This gets a little tricky when we're outside of a corporate setting and we're moving into an academic context where we have things like academic freedom. But once you've identified a problem that has to be solved, it's up to administrators to figure out why, how, and where the problems are occurring. Expect, because the data are clear here, particularly regarding implicit bias, that decisions that require subjective judgment will result in unintended disparities. Removing or limiting discretion with predetermined, objective, meaningful, and rigorously applied criteria are less likely to produce disparities. We know the places where, if we are saying that implicit bias is pervasive, everyone has bias, this is asking us to anticipate that that is going to be true and try to create systems that counteract those biases, rather than trying to remove the bias itself, which is a much more difficult task. But anticipating that when we have subjective power over who we're choosing, why we're choosing, et cetera, this is where it becomes problematic. So what I would like to do is help us think about more policies and systems that help standardize the ways that we engage. This is why we remove names from resumes. This is why we remove schools from resumes. This is why we ask a standard set of questions to candidates when we're interviewing them. So our bias is not entering in the ways that it could if we were just sort of winging it and going by the seat of our pants. So questions for critical reflection. Are my beliefs about an understanding of racism rooted in emotion and gut instinct, or thoughtful and critical reflection and education? Have you really read and thought carefully about this, or are you really just kind of going with what you've picked up along the way? Am I racially competent? Do I understand how racism functions in society? I mentioned this not as some far-fetched group of people who are rallying and claiming white supremacy. I'm talking about it as a system that has created the lack of representation in geosciences and earth sciences. Do you understand that and how it has implications for you and your work? If you believe racism exists and is bad, who is responsible for doing something about it? Or is simply believing it's bad sufficient? Are my actions aligned with my beliefs? Do I value being perceived as a good person, or not racist or not biased, more than engaging the realities of racism? Am I more invested as being seen as someone who cares about these issues, or am I more invested in actually doing something about it? Does my engagement of racism primarily take the form of intellectual exercise and symbolic gestures? Am I more comfortable talking, thinking, and casually disagreeing with racism or other social inequities than I am taking action against it? What do I not understand? Where are my points of tension and resistance in my thinking about racism and about DEI generally? At your institution, lab, and in your disciplines, et cetera, where have you seen the most meaningful progress? What has contributed to these successes? What have been effective strategies? Has there been more progress for some issues more than others, some people more than others, and why? Again, at your institution, lab, and in your discipline, what factors are impeding progress? Beyond representation, how does my specific area of research intersect with DEI, social and racial equity and justice, and social impact? It does for all of us. Ultimately, we're engaging the earth and humans in trying to save the world. There's a link between what you do and how things are working in society. You have 5 minutes and $5. Where would you place your bet of limited time and resources for achieving your organization's or your personal DEI goals? Where would you start? So when I talk about centering race, I'm not saying that other issues aren't important or that we're completely ignoring gender and every other issue. What I'm saying is that the data indicates we are doing the worst on that particular indicator. And limited time and resources would suggest we may want to think about trying to move that specific needle, not to the exclusion of everything else, but thinking about its significance in the work that we're trying to do. I will share these slides. Again, this was just meant for food for thought. I'll share these as well as the best practices are a part of this deck as well, so you'll be able to reference those. But I'd like to turn it over to Christian, who has been engaged in this work for more than a decade now.
Getting up there.
Yeah, and has a lot to say about how this actually translates in his experiences as a climate scientist and engineer. Thanks for being here, Christian.
Thank you. Should I take the clicker?
Yeah.
That's powerful. Yeah, so thank you all for being here today and inviting me to speak. I should have noted my experience is somewhat unique in that I attended a liberal arts college, Morehouse College, where Martin Luther King attended, as well as Georgia Tech. So a historically Black college and a predominantly white institution. And when I was at Morehouse, I actually studied abroad in Japan twice, kind of minored in Japanese and did research in a Japanese research lab one summer. So I've worked in different contexts. And for sure, the biggest difference from my experience at Morehouse to Georgia Tech is that the faculty looked at me like I could be their son, you know? Whereas at Georgia Tech was very clear, there was not this cultural connection. They were surprised I was there, you know, things like that. So it's very distinct. So I just want to clarify for you, if you think that there isn't a difference in the experience of Black students, it's distinct. I actually felt more welcomed in the Japanese environment than an American environment in a predominantly white institution, you know, for context. But I want to give you some clear examples. So I was fortunate enough to go to Durban, South Africa in 2019, and I went for a climate adaptation workshop. And what was interesting about it is I had colleagues join me from America and Italy, and I was the only Black person in this delegation, but we're going to this, you know, this country full of Black folks. And so we're super excited. We're gearing up for the workshop. I'm analyzing like outputs from GCM models. You know, we're trying to give them a sense for sea level rise and extreme heat conditions. And my colleagues are mostly architects that do work that intersects with microclimate, and they want to tell them how can they, you know, change how their cities are designed and make design interventions, right? So, you know, just for this discussion, I'm going to focus on procedural equity. You know, how much are we involving the public? How much are we engaging folks in the adaptation process? But anyway, we gear up for this workshop. We go to Durban in February, and we actually have briefings with city staff, and then we meet with community leaders. But I want to tell you this part before I get into the part with community leaders. A fascinating thing happened where every meeting we had with the city staff, this is the city of Durban staff, started with explaining apartheid. And at the first meeting, you know, I'm looking and I can kind of see my white colleagues cringe when they say like apartheid, you know? And it was like, I could have had some popcorn. I was like, oh, this is delicious. Like, and I was like, wow, this is interesting, you know, thinking about them being in this environment where they're the minority and where people aren't uncomfortable talking about racism. So then the second session, the second briefing, again, this is a climate adaptation workshop. Guys, we just want to start off and talk to you about apartheid and how we're trying to undo apartheid. And by the end, every single session, whether it was a Black South African or white South African, they always started talking about apartheid and how they're trying to undo apartheid. By the end, it was clear they also trusted me. The Black South Africans actually trusted me more and would talk to me more than they would my colleagues from Italy and America. And what I realized by the end was that they were like, oh, we want to make it clear, we're serious about undoing our apartheid. We know you're not serious in America about undoing your apartheid. You know, I mean, that was really the message they were kind of sending in the end. Like, we know you're not serious about addressing racism, but we're really serious about it. And the context in South Africa is that they've actually invested resources and infrastructure in communities where folks that identified as white lived, as opposed to other communities. But you can also imagine you're investing in people and who gets education and those things as well. And that's reflects in our society. So anyway, I just wanted to give that caveat that that we could actually be in a society, and folks are doing work in this space, and they do talk about racism and they prioritize it in the very beginning. You could think of that as being anti-racist in their approach. One thing that came up though was that in this part of Durban, there was a transit camp. And in South Africa, if you're not familiar, everyone's guaranteed access to housing. And so when the World Cup happened there, some folks were displaced. All those folks were basically in an informal settlement, and they're still waiting to get their housing, and they were upset about it. And so as we're gearing up to come to Durban, the city officials are telling us, hey, you know, there might be some protesters there. There's folks that live in this transit camp. We'll have to watch out for them. And what I said was, hey, let's invite them to the workshop. And they were like, no, they've been burning tires and blocking roads. You know, they're just really kind of troublemakers. And I was like, no, like we need their opinion and their voice at the workshop. So I made sure they came to the workshop. Okay, so and that's actually, some of the folks in that transit camp are actually on the right in that front table. I sat at that table and we made sure their inputs and their ideas kind of drove our work. What we did is, if you look on this left, we asked everyone in the room, which included the folks in the transit camp, but business owners, city officials, you know, what are the challenges for the city of Durban, or this district in Durban called Isipingo, and what are opportunities? And then we mapped those challenges and opportunities. You know, this is just high level. This has nothing to do with climate science. Two different approaches we have for changing the built environment to address extreme heat and flooding, right? So those are the efficiency of the urban system, the form and layout, using heat-resistant construction materials, using vegetation cover. And we basically took things from the left and moved them to the right and tried to figure out where there was alignment. And this is where we should focus our research and our work, okay? So just wanted to give you this concrete example of, one, the learning experience for my colleagues, and really kind of the learning about how you could actually center racial equity and racism, anti-racism in your work, and then also just how we brought in the community perspective, to some extent, much to the chagrin of the city staff. Although it went better than the city staff thought, and things went smooth, and I think we had a better outcome as a result. So just giving you this example from Durban, which I love this example from Durban, because it just, one, I just have all these great memories of the stories about apartheid, but also just love that we were able to bring in like the most marginalized group in this Isipingo district into this work. The second example I want to give you now is bringing it home to New York City. And again, we're talking about procedural equity. And this is an image using NASA Landsat data to map land surface temperature in New York City. This is using Landsat 8. And so Recently NOAA has an initiative where they get community members to actually map the urban heat island in their cities. You maybe have heard of this. So you go around with temperature and humidity sensors, you attach them to your cars, or you bike, or you walk. And I was interested in doing this in New York, but I wanted to make sure we actually, involved community organizations from the beginning. And so what I did is I said, let me find a community group. This is true story. I'm gonna give you this is with Columbia. So I'm gonna give you a real example here. I reached out to WEACT because WEACT is interested in extreme heat. They're based in Northern Manhattan. It's an environmental justice focused organization. I knew a couple leaders there. They engaged me a little bit, but said they were moving on and they were focused on other things. And so I actually was ready to give up. I reached out to a colleague, Liv Yoon, who's a postdoc, now faculty at University of British Columbia. And she had a relationship with an organization called South Bronx Unite, which actually focuses on air quality. And so because she already had that relationship, we started talking to them about what the project could look like. So again, before we submit the proposal, before we scope the project, we found a community partner. So this is important to remember. Usually academics, faculty, you design the entire initiative, you're working on responding to the proposal. You're like, oh, let me get a letter of support from a community-based organization. No, what we did is at the very beginning, as we're designing the project, we engaged South Bronx Unite. And our thinking was, even if we can't get them involved with this particular NOAA solicitation, we'll get them involved in the future. We're starting a relationship. We're starting a partnership. What happened is they actually helped us design the study because they actually told us, hey, you should go down these streets as opposed to these streets as you collect data for these reasons. I could talk about those reasons later, but what's interesting, they actually helped us make the study better by design. And one thing I did, one thing I often do, because I don't work for Columbia, I just kind of work with folks at Columbia, is I tried to find funding so we could pay community members for their time, whereas most of the NOAA campaigns, the community members are volunteering their time, right? And that makes sense, right? Because the folks at NOAA, they get paid to do this. You guys, as faculty, postdocs, students actually get paid in a way to do these studies and these work. So I actually found money at Columbia to pay community members. That helped us recruit more community members when we went out in the field to collect the data. And what I should note is there was another campaign planned in Brooklyn. That campaign failed because they didn't get enough community support. They didn't have enough volunteers to go out with them. And I actually talked to the leader of that campaign. I'll show a picture of her later. She acknowledged it's because they didn't do enough community engagement. So we go out in the field and we train folks beforehand, and they attach these sensors to their cars. If you're not familiar with this effort involves Vivek Chandis at Portland State University. Basically, they use Sentinel data, land cover data, as well as the data we collect on the ground, and some different machine learning techniques to basically map the urban heat island. And on the left, you can see the different routes we took from 3 to 4 p.m. that day. This is the modeling of how heat is distributed. What's interesting about this is the community partner suggested we not just focus on the South Bronx, but compare it with the area around Central Park, compare it with the area around Columbia. And this was where social equity and social justice came to play, because really the question is not necessarily what the absolute air temperature humidity is, but the question is, what's the disparity? Who's getting different exposure? And why are they getting different exposures? Because of trees? Is it because of the design? So in this way, they actually improved the routes we chose, but also improved the study overall. This is by working with these community partners. What I want to note for the faculty in particular, because you may be wondering, like, can this help me get tenure and help me advance? It's got lots of press. People think I'm faculty at Columbia because of this project, actually. I'm not faculty at Columbia. People think I am because of this project, because of all the press. It got Soledad O'Brien, CNN, all these folks, because of what it revealed, but also the buy-in we had from the community as we did it. And I would honestly say all the growth that the faculty and students involved received by being part of this process. And this is being published. This work is part of work I'm doing with the New York City Pen on Climate Change that will be published this year in the New York Academy of Sciences. This inspired me to do work on redlining and how redlining intersects with land surface temperature. Many of you guys may be familiar with redlining. This is practiced in the 1930s where people received federally backed home mortgages. When you look at the data closely, you actually see handwritten documentation where they say, don't invest, don't provide mortgages in this community because the Black people live there. Don't provide mortgages because Puerto Rican people live here. Don't provide mortgages because Jewish people live here. So these federally backed mortgages were distributed in a racist manner. We know in the US, wealth is generated by purchasing homes, right? So we know that there's huge wealth implications of this work. I think California actually has done a study, calculated reparations for Black people associated with the state of California based on this work. But anyway, I was interested in unpacking this for New York City. And there was already stuff published on this, but my colleagues at NASA were not interested, you know what I mean? And as Courtney kind of explained, most of my colleagues at NASA a lot of them identify as white, a lot of them are not people of color. And they would not touch this. And I was shocked because this had been published, similar work had been published in Climate, the journal called Climate. And so I was like, based on this work I've done with South Bronx Unite, I bet even in New York City, where there's been so much change since the 1930s, I bet we'll find a similar pattern. Sure enough, we unpacked the data. And if low grades are rated with a D, so these are areas where the homeowners loan corporations that do not invest, and areas with A are areas where you should invest. You see that you have higher land surface temperatures in the poorly graded areas across New York City. And then what we also found is that when you look at the normalized difference vegetation index, which is the index that helps you understand vegetation abundance and vegetation health, you see lower NDVI, so in theory, less vegetation in areas of poor grades. And this is consistent with the previous slide, more heat exposure, less vegetation, less green space. So anyway, my work with South Bronx Unite pointed me towards this research, even though my colleagues at NASA GISS were uncomfortable with this research. When my students and team would present it, sometimes when I wasn't there, they would tell them, you should take the word racism out of your slide or things like that. And I had to push back on that, just really realizing that, back to my Durban example, just my colleagues who identify as white are very uncomfortable talking about race and racism. And I did my own homework and research and realized that, we're all kind of socialized in the US not to talk about race and racism, but particularly in white households. It's likely that your parents never will talk to you about anti-Black racism or white supremacy the entire time you grow up, even if you ask about it, even if you ask about a Rodney King or another incident, most white parents will not talk about racism. They might say, there's some bad people. They won't explicitly talk about anti-Black racism or white supremacy. So this is natural to some extent. But we have to understand how this intersects with our work. And this is just kind of a really clear example where this is published work, where people are getting research funding to explore this work, where this has important implications for how we design cities, how we think about microclimates. But this is something my colleagues at NASA had really overlooked. And this work could have been done really years ago. All right. So I want to talk a little about some best practices real quickly, and mostly I'm just going to point you towards a resource that you can use. Again, I'm really interested in anti-racism in my work, so creating racial equity, addressing racial inequities. I'm less of the diversity and inclusion expert per se. That's definitely more Dr. Cogburn's expertise. But I've been really successful with diversifying climate science and integrating racial equity in my work. So I'm hopeful that I can answer questions and give you more insights later. This is a great source. This is Ali et al., where they talk about 6 essential constructs for effective anti-racism. And there's a variety of things on here. I think on your own, you should take a look at this and see what applies well to you. One thing to note, as you have a research lab, it's important to talk about race because race may intersect in ways you don't realize. So for example, during my PhD I got sent to South Georgia to collect data from farmers in South Georgia. My research advisor, European, folks on my research team, East Asian and European and white American. And it didn't occur to them that, is it actually safe for Christian to go to South Georgia to collect this data? Now, I was fully aware, and everyone in my circle was like, be safe, only travel during the day, do these things. There's Klan down there. There's all these folks you need to be worried about. I have family from South Georgia, so I'm very aware of the culture. But it never came up to them. It never came up to them that this actually could be a safety risk for me to do this work. So but if you can't ever talk about race, it will never come up. So take a look at this. That's a real example that I can offer from my experience. There's also this work by Chaudhry on 10 simple rules for building an anti-racist lab. Take a look at this. One thing I would just point out to you, and again, this is on the safety side. I've had my colleague Liv Yoon, and this is a true story, who's at University of British Columbia. She actually told me she left New York and went back to Canada before she finished her postdoc because of racist attacks she was receiving, anti-Asian hate type experiences she was receiving here. And this is a postdoc. This is not like years ago. This is just like a year ago. So, and I wonder how many of you during that time here were talking to your postdoc. I mean, hopefully this was happening. But when we think about racist violence against, and I can give you examples from my time as well in undergrad and grad school, this is not like far and away. This is not a long gone thing. This is happening in present day. So again, you have to be open and make yourself available to talk about race and racism. And one thing I would note, this came up quite a bit during my work, is the collaboration networks you're part of. You'll think a lot about how to create opportunities for folks to get grants and publications. And one thing I'll note too is that before I close, because I know I'm probably over, is that in my experience, where I was the only African-American student in my program, my research lab actually didn't have any Americans other than me. For the most part, it's pretty much all folks from East Asia, Africa, or Europe. But I was the only African-American in the entire environmental fluid mechanics and water resource program when I was there. The unique experience I had was that I would say almost every professor I had told me I solved a problem in a way that no other student had it ever solved. These are fluid mechanics problems. These are statistics problems. And, I would say, I think part of it is just I had different training. I have a different background than them. I'm approaching the problems in different ways. And this is a common theme. If you go to this article, you'll see the references where students at the margins, students from underrepresented backgrounds actually come up with novel solutions, right? They're avoiding the group think that often happens. And I often see this in my own experience with my students. So just want to also point out the value proposition around innovation in your research that comes from diversity.
Thank you. Yeah, so we want to open it up to get your reactions and thoughts. And I know we're putting a lot on your plate, but want to see how you're feeling. Just to quickly add that, this is not fun to talk about. We don't enjoy doing it. I'd rather be doing my research. I'm sure you'd rather be doing yours. But this is a part of our reality in terms of people who care about the world that we occupy. And I'm assuming you're one of those people, and this is a critical piece of it. And so, we want to support your journey and continue on our own journeys related to this work. So we've highlighted what we're doing here at LEAP. We've offered some food for thought to question and challenge your own beliefs. Christian has offered concrete examples of the ways in which DEI and anti-racism can intersect with climate adaptation research. We've offered some best practices. And again, there's a whole host of resources in addition to the ones that we've shared that we will make available to you. And then we'll move into thinking about strategic planning. We see this as being foundational to your ability to think about who am I? What are my spheres of influence? What can I actually do? What's within my realm of power and influence to do something about? And what am I going to do, right? So we're trying to set up our conversation for that. I think for the sake of time, I'll save the spheres of influence reflection and move that to the second part, but I would like to open it up and get your reactions and thoughts and the ways in what's coming up for you and ways in which this is intersecting with your life as a researcher and scientist. Yeah, Johnny in the back.
For being here to talk about this. My reaction was partly about the implicit bias side of things. And I'm somebody who's in the past, I've been aware of this idea that it's actually not as helpful as we might have initially thought. But it's really interesting to hear you say, Courtney, that it's just now been seen as just not useful at all. Because in the past, in various committees, I've been somebody who's advocated for it. And just speaking from my own experience, I actually personally found it very useful. So that was my reaction. I'm saddened to hear that it's not, on a broader scale, it's not seen as useful at all. Interesting and sad to hear that. And I guess, for example, like the recruitment stage, being aware of your implicit bias, like you said, allows you to put in a system like a rubric or something to avoid you just relying on your own instinct. And I guess that was the way that I always thought implicit bias training really helps.
It does, yep. Mm-hmm.
But in a broader sense, it's not really making any difference, which is just, it's unfortunate to hear.
No, it does. That action what's helpful about implicit bias research is that we know how pervasive it is and that it influences your behavior. What we don't have empirical evidence for is that your awareness is the thing that changes your behavior. You have to take some conscious step to implement a strategy to overcome your own bias. So creating a rubric, blinding resumes, et cetera, is an action that helps overcome your bias. That's really useful. But simply being aware that I might be biased in and of itself is not useful. And then efforts to actually reduce bias, there's not empirical evidence to suggest that that is sustainable.
That makes sense.
It's another question in the back.
Thanks for a really great presentation.
Thank you.
One thing I was wondering about is how this interacts with like open source software and the community tools that like everyone here's work basically relies on, like the data structure and machine learning libraries. Like they're all built in this weird way that doesn't really exist in like the normal workplace, where they're kind of mostly built out of like individual spare time contributions. And then if they get big enough, they end up with like corporate sponsorship. And that model doesn't really map on very well to like a normal workplace. Like you don't have research groups where people just do stuff in their evenings. And then once the research gets good, then it gets funded. The other thing that's weird about those communities from like a diversity perspective is that it's all online and you don't even necessarily know who you're talking to. Like you don't actually have to put your real name anywhere. But yet those communities are not diverse. And well, partly because of those reasons and partly for things I don't understand. And I guess I just wondered if you had like thoughts on any of that or like resources on any of that, because it does cross over a lot with like the work that we do here.
Yeah, I think one example is one that Christian gave around insular collaborations and the people we tend to work with. Realistically, we know, right? Empirically, we know that white people in particular have very segregated networks. Most of you have very white lives, both professionally and personally. So then when you seek out people to work with for a hobby or a side project, you tend to work with people who look like you, and your networks tend to be more segregated than other groups of people. So it contributes in part to that kind of cycle. I think part of how we're trying to address some of that with LEAP is, say, the suite of tools through LEAP Pangeo, and trying to engage diverse stakeholders at the very beginning to say, this is what this is. How would you use this? What kind of data do you need? What kinds of questions do you have? How might we set this up that makes it a little bit more accessible in terms of how to use it? Maybe we need to film a tutorial that helps people to work their way through it to get them started. But we have to think very actively about who are we consulting when we're thinking about the design of those tools in terms of user interface, for instance, and how are we invested in making it as accessible and usable as possible in terms of, do we take time we have dedicated to LEAP to create a tutorial or create a curriculum related to that tool so that it's also accessible because people have that educational resource. So that's one way to think about it.
So I have observation over the years. So I have been in both positions as the recipient of certain microaggression or something not so small aggression. And also on the other hand, I also academic leaders who try to make a difference and try to create. What I have found is that by simply assuming that underrepresented member of underrepresented groups can advocate for themselves, or assuming that a one or two leader can make a huge difference, is a delusional assumption. That I feel that what really needed is a large scale bystander training, like to give people the two things. One is the skill to recognize microaggressions and toxic behavior and practices, which I think the implicit bias training does, touch a little bit upon that. But recognition is not enough. Concrete ways for people to engage in a dialogue, to intervene as a bystander once they recognize what are the ways that they can each contribute to improve the experiences of those members we bring into our community, try to diverse. It's only we're only set ourselves up to fail if we bring people into our group and then only make them experience, toxic, without intended. No, like I could say, no one really intend. Well, I won't say no one, but most people don't intend what happens. So I wonder what are some of the suggestions about such a bystander training. And
yeah, I think it's like to Johnny's point as well. It's not that being aware of your bias is not good, right? That you may have a clearer sense that I may be doing something, whether I'm aware of it or not, that's having a negative impact on people, and that awareness is a good thing. But it's not sufficient. But I do think it's helpful in terms of helping us see that our good intentions are also not sufficient. In terms of training, I really struggle with this. And so I've even talked about, like some of you, I've talked with you about your talks and how you're presenting your talks. And I've talked about you're sometimes presenting some really complex details and you're pouring it into a container, my container that has a lot of holes that can't hold those complicated details. I need you to build and plug those holes and build the container that can hold that information in a meaningful way. I see training around DEI in a very similar way. Most people have not done sufficient work around why do we even have to do it in the first place? Why does it exist? What are the root causes? Don't have firmly established, educated, competent beliefs about the underlying reasons for DEI. We tend to jump to training. And it's very difficult to jump to soft skills. This is what you do in your lab, when you don't understand why it's necessary in the first place, or you don't even fully believe that you have somehow contributed to the problem, or that your bias is somehow really still leaking through in spite of your best intentions. And until we correct that, I see soft training as being a bit more challenging. It's important, but there's some steps that need to happen prior to that.
I got a question for Christian.
Yeah.
Back here. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I just had a question just about your time at Georgia Tech. I thought that was really interesting. I was curious, what were the things that the community did in your time there that you thought were helpful, that you'd want to share, that we could try to replicate, or others could replicate, like things like role models or kind of groups that you're part of. I was just curious whether things in the community that it sounds like it was not very inviting, but was there something that was, I'm curious about what was there something that did make it inviting that we could try to, learn from? Yeah,
I mean, it ties to the last question too. I actually, so my dream was to go to MIT, and I was deciding between MIT and Georgia Tech, and I wanted to go to MIT because there was 3 faculty of color there that I was thinking of working with. You guys probably even know these folks. One was Dara Intakabi, Raphael Bras, and the other's name escapes me. He's Sudanese. And I went there, and it was cool, it was interesting, but I experienced a microaggression with a white I think, German student. And there was a white American student who actually did the bystander trading thing. I'm talking, I probably lost a little bit of an accent, but I was talking and the German student says to me, oh, I can't understand. I'm sorry, can you say it again? I don't understand your dialect. And the white female student said, kind of looked like, you're going to scare him away, and she just kind of turned and was like, no, he has an accent, he's from a different region, but, and at that moment I was kind of like, okay, like this isn't terrible, but this was still a microaggression. Obviously I was experiencing microaggressions the whole time I was in Boston, very different than Atlanta, but in the end, when I looked around, I didn't see any Black or brown students. There was one Black female student graduating, and I was kind of like, I don't want to be the only Black student here. So Georgia Tech, the environmental fluid mechanics program, was all 12 white men, no women, either from America or Europe, but the students were very diverse. And I knew, and my understanding was when you're in graduate school, you're going to interact a lot with students. And so that's exactly what happened. I was interacting with a lot of students from the so-called Middle East, from East Asia, almost no interaction with the white American students. I had microaggression experiences with white American students at Georgia Tech. And I just kind of found this sanctuary with the other students of color, in my program. So I would say if I was not able to create those bonds with them, I've studied abroad in Japan, I have a lot of friends from different cultures, so it was easy for me. But the relationships between the white American students and the white faculty were just different. They were able to talk and convene, and we actually perceive bias and when did people's proposals happen? When did they take their qualifying exams? When did they defend? And I talked about the bias, and faculty told me, stop talking about this, Christian, if you were to graduate. This is straight, I'm being straight up with you. They told me, stop talking about it. So I would say to you, there was not this thing there other than the Black Grad Student Association for me. And that was like my sanctuary. And then just the fact that I was a big enough student leader on campus where the faculty couldn't intimidate me to not, describe the program the way I saw it.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yeah, thanks, indeed.
This is just spectacular. And I think, there's so many layers.
I see you.
So many layers of challenge and opportunity. The one I'd like to bring up, which I learned as a journalist covering climate change, now I'm like 35 years. The biggest mistake I made was being climate centric and not looking at what is the problem here. And when I started talking to social scientists and getting into developing countries and seeing that vulnerability, as in Durban, the flooding just recently, when you look at, well, what just happened there? And Catherine Sutherland, who's an expert in urban climate risk in Durban, said it was all about injustice and who's living in floodplains. And the media only wanted to know how much of it was climate change. So there's a climate change. The biggest level of bias I think we have in this community, whether you're a climate journalist or a climate scientist, is we're starting from the foundational idea that climate change is the problem. The word change, as opposed to climate risk. And one of my opportunities, and when I train journalists now anywhere in the world or talk to scientists, I say, just wake up in the morning and start your day with climate risk. And there's a formula. I could show you the slide. Diana Liverman, a great social climate scientist, geographer, led me to this way of looking at climate risk. Risk is a function of the hazard. This is a hazard-free world. There's no risk. But it's much more a function of exposure and vulnerability. And as soon as you start saying, climate risk, how do I reduce climate risk? Instead of thinking, how do I slow climate change? Focusing on slowing climate change is actually racist. It's actually very biased toward that element of the system. It misses, hides, obscures the other drivers of risk. And vulnerability, then you start to say, who's vulnerable? And immediately, the racial and poverty and like who's marginalized, that all comes to the foreground. So just starting, like having a little camera in your head that can flip a little filter that's like, get us out of that climate change centrism, which goes right, the IPCC, I wrote once, wouldn't it have been better if we had an intergovernmental panel on climate risk in 1980? Climate change is one driver of risk, but all these other elements would be in the foreground instead of in the background. So that's just one thing I think. And I could talk further about this to anyone.
Thank you. I think we have time for a final question from online.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Marcus.
Hi, Marcus.
Hi. I really liked your point, Courtney, about sort of how narrow our spheres of collaboration are. This is something that I've always felt like I tend to just collaborate with people who I end up talking to and hanging out with at conferences, and I feel like it subselects in a way that isn't really fair in a way, you know. But I guess the question I wanted to ask is if there's a plan at LEAP to sort of take the young scientists, and I want to focus on the young scientists, I think, because I think that's where a lot of the sort of filtering out of the filtering out happens that sort of supports lack of diversity and lack of inclusivity. Is there sort of a plan to take young scientists, postdocs, PhDs, and sort of take them to the next level, to build their spheres of community, to sort of bring them to the point where they can write a proposal? Do we have a plan that like postdocs will be ready to write a proposal at the end of their postdoc? Like, is there some sort of structure that we're building to set these people on a path where they have an advantage and where they have a sort of diverse group of collaborators? You know, are we giving them all the tools that they need? I think that would be nice if we could do that.
I think that's a great idea, Marcus. We haven't talked about that as a collective. I'm sure some individual PIs are thinking about it that way, but I really like the idea of standardizing both the professional and social development around these issues, but also the opportunities that are made available in terms of writing grants, papers, et cetera, and making sure we're being consistent. In what ways can we, at the organizational level of LEAP, help support that? So I definitely made note, and this is exactly the kind of thing that's really helpful when you complete the survey for me to know what sorts of things you think are really important or where you'd like support and just ideas you have in general. So thank you for that, Marcus. Great.
Yeah. Thanks so much again, Courtney. And
oh, we have 10 minutes? Oh, okay. There was another question here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Go ahead.
To address Tian's point about microaggressions, do you two think you can deal with microaggressions like on the fly? Because like most microaggressions are like remarks which are like really hard to catch. You're like, oh, like 5 seconds later you realize that, but then like the person's gone. So that's like a little bit annoying.
Yeah, it's part of what's so harmful about micro is misleading. It's part of what's so harmful about subtle exposures to these kinds of harms and threats, because they're difficult to make the other person aware of. And it would take a long conversation, and we don't have a video to run back and show them exactly what they said and what they did. They may not have done their own work related to this. So it's really, really challenging. It's part of, I referenced my work in virtual reality, and it's part of why I created that experience where you're a Black male as a child, adolescent, and adult experiencing racism from that perspective in virtual reality, because you're able to represent some of those subtleties, like being ignored. That's difficult to explain to someone that 10 milliseconds that you didn't look at me was a microaggression. It's difficult to explain that to someone when they haven't experienced it themselves. But yeah, it's a challenge. And I would say for myself, I have learned to navigate and cope with those things. I wouldn't be here in this space at Columbia in particular if I hadn't. But from a health perspective, those hits are actually quite significant and add up over time, which is why we call the VR experience a 1,000-cut journey. It's just cut, day after day. That definitely add up physically and mentally.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, I mean, it evolves as your role evolves, as your status evolves. You know, when I was younger, it was very different for me than it is now. So I would say, you know, if you're a Black man, probably about 12 or 13, there's the shift from you being cute and adorable to women clutching their purses in the elevator or kind of white people crossing the street. when they walk by you. And so I think for a lot of young Black men in America, they think, how can I make myself more comfortable, make white people more comfortable? And my perception was the opposite. Mine was like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. Something's wrong with them. You know, very much thinking of racism as and bias or racism as kind of a what'd you say?
Pathology.
Pathology. Yeah, yeah. At a young age, I thought of it as a pathology. So for me, I think it was not the same, but now I do tell people. And so what I'll do is, for example, I'll get an email from a white woman and it's Christian and Dr. Johnson. I'd like to be with you. And in my signature line is Dr. Christian Brett, you know what I mean? And so I'll usually reflect, be very calm when I respond. And I'll just kind of send an email and say, hey, I just want to point this out to you. Sometimes we don't say doctor when there's women and people of color. That person, my colleague Dan Bader, is actually not even a PhD, but I am a PhD. And it's in my signature line. You know, so those are kind of, I'll do that and the response goes either way, but usually to your point, in the moment, I don't always respond. Sometimes I want to be calm when I respond. Sometimes I don't notice till later. And I think for students, you just want to have a safe space where they can go to someone, because if it's their PhD advisor, right, or their postdoc, they can't go to them, right? So you want to have a culture where there's someone they can talk to, someone they can go to. If they're the only brown person, the only Black person, the only South Asian person, or whatever in the entire program, who can they go to talk about that? It's just something to think about. But thank you for bringing up about microaggressions. It's different for me now, but it was always easy. In some ways, it wasn't so difficult. I always thought of racism as pathology. And I still think of racism as pathology. It's hurting people that identify as white in ways they're not always cognizant of.
Dave?
Yeah, so thinking back to Marcus's point and point you made about sort of intentionally diversifying our collaborator networks, I guess, which is probably a goal of LEAP. I'm curious about your perspective about engagement with MSIs. So at NCAR, there's a lot more of intentional activity to try to engage with minority serving institutions, which seems to me on the face of it like a good thing to do, but I'm curious whether there's, what your thoughts are on pros or cons related to that. And then, you know, if it's pro, then I guess within LEAP, we should maybe be thinking along those lines too, to find ways to bring in the MSI institutions into our activities.
Yeah, so I think engaging minority serving institutions is really important. I also think that I have a longer set of thoughts around this, around in terms of what skills are necessary to do the work that you need, and that how that, if you are more expansive about that, that might broaden even the kinds of disciplines that you go to and where you recruit. So minority serving institutions are a good solid place to start. There's other institutions and also potentially other disciplines where you'll find more diversity, where people could potentially be caught up to speed, right, to do the kinds of work that you want to do. So I definitely think that's part of what we should be doing. I think there's also organizations that are tech focused, environment focused, climate justice focused, climate science focused, that are attached to particular affinity groups that we should be engaging as well, both in terms of in solidarity, but also in terms of recruiting and bringing those people into the work that's happening at LEAP. The con is when you bring them into a context where they're isolated, they're the only person, you're not introducing them into a lab where people have really accounted how their experiences may be different. You haven't done the work with your community where they aren't going to be perceived as deficient in some way, or that some exception has been made in order to recruit them, which again, in both explicit and implicit ways, is going to color their experiences in the lab, what they're included in, how they're perceived. Going to microaggressions, the number of conversations where I feel like it starts with someone assuming they're smarter than me is pretty common, right? And so if someone's coming into a context where they haven't done their own work around their own biases and their own practices related to how they interact with people, you're potentially bringing them into a toxic environment. So there's multiple steps that need to happen, but it is an important way to engage. We have 5 minutes. If anyone else, yes, in the front here, Cara.
Maybe addressing how to address like outside of LEAP, like larger structural issues within like the neurosciences community, and like what are effective strategies to do that?
I think the norms that we set here and the ways that we're trying to build and think about this, again, not as trainings that we go through, but ways in which we're trying to build it and integrate it into the work that we're doing here at LEAP, and documenting that and disseminating that in various ways through public engagement, through written documents, et cetera, I think is an important part of influencing those broader structures. I think a lot of people care about this and they have no idea what to do, or they've tried a number of things and the needle just hasn't moved and they feel stuck. And so I think the more that we can communicate, if we're successful, why were we successful? What did we do? If we weren't, why weren't we successful? And really being very critical and thoughtful about that. I think that's a really important step to trying to help other well-intentioned people who want to do a good job at this. And then I think also continuing to build and share resources that already exist where people have told us exactly what to do. But there has to be a sense of responsibility that it's not the DEI person's job to change geosciences, right? It's your job, right? And so how do we help more of us take on that responsibility in this work? Savannah? Oh, sorry, I missed one. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, my question was about, so it was like, I want to,
yeah,
I think notice that presentation from
yeah, I think that just so many, it's just not a part of our curriculum and discussion across the board, even outside of Columbia and outside of LEAP. And I think we have to center it. And I think so many people feel ill-equipped to address it. But it's so important, not certainly in terms of physical differences and ability, but also those invisible differences that show up when someone's working in a lab where they may have a learning disability or they may be neurodivergent in some way, that it's important for us to be able to have conversations about that. And how do we need to think about how we have conversations with our students and postdocs, et cetera. So I now know that I knew before that this was central, and we'll integrate that into our learning and conversations and help people deal with it in more meaningful ways. But it's essential and often invisible, which is why I think it gets ignored so much.
Take last question.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a question as much as like we've talked a little bit about this yesterday, Courtney, but like trying to figure out your sphere of influence. And I feel like we all can probably make like a larger impact within our department if we're willing to like step up and value DEI as like important and an integral part of research and not like a separate activity. Like I know our department, I've tried to get faculty involved in like rewriting like the code of conduct or like reevaluating how we do grad admissions and like making sure we include land acknowledgements at the beginning of our talks. Like it feels really small and like stuff that's manageable, but then like when you see departments that are doing that, it like can really easily disseminate to like the college or then other departments in other schools. And like those are things that I think we can individually work on, and like examples of things that like when then students come visit and they see that these are things that you've prioritized, like it can make minority students especially feel like it's not like performative allyship and it's something that everyone is like willing to put an effort to make better. So like if anybody has any ideas or like wants ideas of things that they could do, I'm the DI person in my department at UCI, so I can talk about it all day.
Thank you.
So yeah.
Yeah, and I look forward to you to sharing. We talked about different resources. I look forward to you sharing those so that we can make sure they get disseminated. And so in part 2, we'll close now, but in part 2, we're going to get really concrete, right? About where are my roles? Where do I have power and influence? What are some specific goals and actions that I can take related to these commitments? And we're going to focus, excuse me, today we'll focus on one goal and one outcome, but we'll have you do some homework and fill this out in a more substantial way, and try to create a system of accountability about that and come back to it a year from now and see how much progress we've made. So hopefully we can get very concrete in our second session to help people decide exactly how they're willing to commit and how they want to move forward. And I understand that can be difficult and challenging. And that's why we're here, to try and help you do that. And then again, provide additional resources to help support you. So we're overdue for a break. We'll take the break and we'll come back. I don't know how we've adjusted the schedule, but I'll let you take over. Thank you all for engaging and so thoughtfully with part one. We will, continue to create opportunities to have these kinds of conversations and hope you will continue to engage with us. But we also are quite aware that we can't just talk, that we need to do things differently as well. So we want to help support you in your thinking around that. To get started, we want you to take 2 minutes just to yourself. You can write it, you can use your device. And your device will actually be your computer, or laptop, or iPad will be useful for this next phase if you have it with you. But we want you to take just 2 minutes to reflect on your spheres of influence. So think very concretely about the multiple professional roles that you hold. What are your general responsibilities in those roles? And in what ways do you have power and influence related to those roles? And so this will be helpful in terms of identifying goals and concrete actions, because you'll link it back to your reflections around this. So we'll give you 2 minutes to do that. And then Christian will start to walk us through the strategic plan. The document for the strategic plan, the slides you'll use are on the annual meeting website. So you can link directly to part 2 of this session and it'll take you to those slides. So we'll give you 2 minutes and then we'll check back in. Okay, and you can keep working on this. I know some of us wear many hats, especially more senior people in the room. So what we first like you to do is just the person next to you, if you're in a little cluster, just to sort of bounce off what kinds of roles are you identifying, and start to just think together what types of what types of power and influence do you have related to that, and start to share that with the person next to you. It's just a sounding board, just to talk out loud about what it is that's coming up for you, and they may be able to give you some insights. So if you could take about just a few minutes to do that. We don't have time to do the full discussion here, so we can move into. And if you want to flag one of us down, we're happy to come help as well. Just in a pair or in a small group, just share what you came up with, what you're coming up with in terms of your power and influence. Okay. So recognizing that may not feel like enough time, but hopefully you started to see what sorts of things came up for other people, things maybe you didn't think about or imagine. But let's just take a couple of minutes. What types of spheres came up for you in terms of related to your role, your influence? What types of categories are you falling into? Just so I can sort of track some of it. Yeah, Laura. Educator, okay. Yeah, you can just yell out. Student. Graduate student, undergraduate? Brad? Okay, okay. It sometimes makes a difference. Okay. Yes. Mentor. Yes. Connector of people. Others? Reviewer? In the back? Management. Mm-hmm. And sometimes these are formal roles, like I think in your case as a DEI fellow, and sometimes it's just your personality that you are a connector of people, which also matters. Yes. Okay, yeah. Researcher, okay. So you get the idea, the kinds of roles that we occupy. You probably wear multiple hats. How did you interpret power and influence? What sorts of things were coming up related to that? Yeah, John. Policy, so you control the policies in your lab. Sometimes you're on committees in your department. Okay. Others? So capacity building, maybe, okay. Evaluations and grading. It's a big one. Yeah. Reporting behaviors, what do you mean? Reporting behaviors. So we're going back to like ally, bystander types of roles. Okay, any others? Yeah, Mike. Recommendation letters. Resource. Performance reviews. Okay.
Get your hand up.
Hiring, recruitment, job posting. Okay, so you get the idea that if you have some control over the decisions that get made about that thing, that's a power. That's a potential to influence. And so when we move into the next section with which Christian will walk us through, we're going to name some of those goals that we have. We're going to name associated actions, excuse me, and think about the ways in which we can actually move the needle even in a short period of time. Potentially, there's low hanging fruit and there's bigger things that are the long game. But we're going to try to think about a combination of those. What we do.
So you guys maybe have heard the phrase strategic plan before. Usually it starts with like a vision. So you're imagining what you want your system or your society or your organization to be like. And it's a good idea to think of the most ideal state of that organization. Think of, allow all the constraints to go away. Just think about what would be the most ideal lead, the most ideal Columbia or most ideal academic space. And imagine what the goals might look like to get there. So today, we're going to actually think about goals for the next school year, and then ultimately we want you to think about the next 4 or 5 years. But this is an example from NASA. This is actually from NASA's DEIA strategic plan. So this is publicly available. This isn't classified. You can find this online.
It's linked in the resources as well. Yes.
It's under the resources, and they're showing themes here on the left. So they have a theme of workforce diversity, a theme of workforce equity and inclusion, and then they write out the full goal. Like their goal is to recruit, hire, retain, and so forth. And then on the right is the outcome. This is really important. So kind of to the point that Courtney and others have expressed earlier, it's not, the intention is not enough, we want outcomes, right? Just like anything you do, you'll find this, if you work in industry, you'll find this academia, you've got to get to the outcomes. You've got to publish the articles. You've got to win the grants. You've got to write the books, right? So it's so important to align your goal and your outcomes. And so what we're going to do as a first step for strategic planning is you individually are going to think about DEI, and maybe anti-racist goals and think about what the outcome would be for that.
And just quickly, when you're thinking about action steps, I need to get to the outcome. It may be get support. It may be find resources on. You may not know actually what to do just yet. So there may be an interim step. So education, finding resources, getting support might be one of the steps that you identify as being essential to being able to move forward.
So we're going to get this going today, just focused on one goal for the next upcoming year. This is something you can do based on your spheres of influence. Okay. And then you'll further define this as homework. You'll build something out that's more robust. And what's nice is we've created kind of an opportunity for us to review this next year. So next year, when you guys come back again, you can look back at what you came up with today, what you come up with later, and see if your perspective has changed, if you've made progress.
And we'll try to think as well about interim accountability systems, whether you partner with someone or whether you use me as a point of accountability, whether we just coordinate asynchronously and update as things move along. I think there's a few different options there.
Yeah. So I think so right here you can find
the other link.
I'll just, yeah, so we're gonna share I guess, do they have access to?
The link to the slides are on the meeting agenda where you can get all of the slides. So for part 2, if you're able to access that, you don't need them necessarily. You can just take notes, but we've created a template for you to use. So today we'll focus on one goal and one action, but hopefully you'll be able to spend some time filling this out more fully. And we'd like you to, not today, you don't have to, but we were asking you to identify 4 goals for the year. We'd like one of those goals to be specifically focused on race. They don't all have to, but to think about that as one outcome that you're interested in moving the needle on. So if you can access the slides for part 2 on the meeting agenda, you can go ahead and do that, or you'll just be able to take notes and you can fill in the template later.
So get the slide, just copy the template to your machine so you have it, as opposed to editing that live Google Doc. And then just put your last name in there. In the beginning, you can put your name and the spheres of influence. That's not urgent right now to put a photo, but you can put your name and the spheres of influence. And this is kind of what it's going to look like. So here you can have your name, spheres of influence photo. And
the photo is just to visually hold yourself accountable. Put your face there.
Yeah, or it could be a Pokemon that resembles you or whatever you like. And then here you can map the goals to the outcomes. So just as a basic starting point, you can insert 1-sentence goals. We want them to be short and sweet. Like we're not trying to, we want to be kind of direct when we set goals. We don't want to kind of meander around too much. So we would suggest 1-sentence goals and a 1-sentence outcome, focusing on the red part just for 2023, 2024.
So again, to clarify, we're asking you to do this more fully after we leave here. So we already have the template set up for 4 goals for this year, and then you have a second set of documents for next year. But for today, we're focusing on 1 goal and 1 outcome so that you can think more deeply about it.
I think in the template, is there one with more space?
Yes.
Yeah. So this is could be the one you could use for today. There's lots of space in here. You decide to use the template. 4 1-sentence goals, and then list the outcomes you intend. 4 is our target. If you don't get 4, not the end of the world, but of your goals, at least 1 race-related, kind of recognizing when we get in equity conversations in spaces that are predominantly white, we tend to revert to gender equity or revert to ableism, or we tend to avoid discussions about race. So we're trying to be deliberate about in your goals, make sure one of your goals relates to race.
So we're going to give you about 10 minutes to do this. If you come up with more goals, that's fine, or more outcomes, that's fine. We just didn't want to put too much pressure on people to do that. And then we'll come back and again, share as a full group. You don't have to break into smaller groups to get a sense of what you're coming up with. So this is just practice. It's just an attempt to try and be more concrete about what it is we envision ourselves being able to do. So take 10 minutes. Again, wave your hand if you want us to come help or support or talk through anything. And then we'll come back together. Can I answer any questions about this now before we go into the 10 minutes? Okay, great. Okay. So what's coming up? What, you may be hesitating, not sure what to say, not sure if you're the person who should be showing up to do anything and help anyone. What kinds of issues are coming up, or what types of things do you feel like you have clarity about that you're identifying? And it can change, you can modify it, but it's helpful for the group to hear what's coming up for you because it might help inform the direction they go as well. So what sort of thing? Yeah, Lauren. Yeah, please. Yeah. Do we need to do the microphones? I think it's for the online people. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I can share my strategic goal, and then maybe I'll say, first of all, what's my issue? What's my question?
Okay, sure.
I'm confusing the how to accomplish the goal with the output and the outcomes.
Okay.
So my goal is to produce research that centers on schools as racialized organizations in terms of what kind of opportunities to learn about climate they provide to students. but I'm not sure what is the output or the outcome. Is the outcome that we're going to have professionals and policymakers that are more aware? Or am I missing a step?
A more immediate, yeah, that's an outcome. A more immediate outcome may be I present a paper at X, I write a paper on X, I provide a report to the Department of Education, I consult with the education around schools as racialized spaces, and then the how comes in between that. What method are you going to use to engage in that kind of research? Yeah.
And to the extent you can, like, it's nice when they're quantifiable. So I will publication, 1+ publications, 2+ officials. I think you talked about reaching. I'll have communication with, or we'll cite my work. But it doesn't have to be quantifiable, but it's nice when it can be. And the how is the strategy. So we don't have that in the template, but that could be part of the strategic plan. Is what's your strategy from getting from your goal to your outcome, which may require some thought.
Yeah. And that could fall under the action piece as well, the how. Yeah. Others?
I guess a common theme was skill training, but to make it more impactful, one critical aspect is making sure we advertise to groups that do not know about the skills they want to learn, or may not know that they should learn to further their own careers. So actively advertising these trainings to underrepresented minorities would be one way to go about that.
So what was the first piece? I missed the first part.
Sorry, skill training and just making sure that we advertise these trainings.
Skill training and advertising, the tools to build the skills themselves, but also the knowledge of what you need to have in order to do this kind of work.
Like if we host workshop, you'll know that.
Yeah. Yeah, so and just to add, like that's a good way to use your knowledge transfer team and me as a DEI person to try and connect you with organizations with which we already have a relationship. Our Future Science, for instance, is one in-house LEAP organization where a lot of you may be able to have that kind of impact. But yeah, that's it exactly.
That came up actually in the break when I was talking. So, that's not like that could be the goal to some extent, and the outcome is we publicize at this many organizations, this many institutions. What I like is the constraint. So I would say, let's say, what would you normally advertise? Let's say
maybe just like Columbia Science.
Columbia Science. I would say we will not send out any advertisement to Columbia Science until we've reached 10 organizations. We've already reached out to 10 organizations that are mostly people of color women. And that hard constraint will make sure it gets done because you need to advertise to Columbia Science.
Yeah.
If you don't do that constraint, you'll advertise to Columbia Science the hour before you send it to 10 of those other 10 organizations. We'll put that constraint in, like, we don't even get to advertise it the normal way we would until we've already sent it to those organizations.
And normally there's like a participant constraint as well. So if you don't advertise those groups ahead of time, then you fill up your space with people who already have exposure anyway. So
yeah. Yeah, we have time for one more. Again, this was just to get you started, for us to try and support and give you some examples, but I am an ongoing resource to help you think about this. And hopefully we have your commitment to try and flesh this out and get more concrete. I had a slide about, are your beliefs aligned with your actions? And this is a way to do that, right? I often have people ask me, exasperated about DEI and what can I do and nothing is working. This is what you do. This is where you start and try to get really concrete about what you have control over. You can't fix everything related to structural racism in society, but there are some things that you have influence over. So hopefully you can spend some time giving that some thought. And I'm more than happy to help support you in your thinking, both in conversation and also in terms of providing resources. I want to thank Christian for joining us and continuing to do the work that you do in this space. And thank you all for being so thoughtful and engaged. We really appreciate you. We know these aren't easy conversations to have. So thank you. And we need to move into the next session.
Thanks so much.
So I have some notes here that I would like to respond to in the earlier section.
Initially, we are hoping to give everyone an update of the education program, but I think education has been included in a lot of public announcements. I think most people know what we're doing. So I will go a very quick round of updates just to remind everyone that what we have been doing on the education front. So this is almost like a landscape of things we're doing. So we have a curriculum. So we try to teach our courses. Pierre's course, Machine Learning for Environmental Engineering and Sciences, is available on GitHub. So for our colleague from other institute, if you want to replicate a course, use part of the course, or for the PhD students and postdoc, if you want to learn certain concept, or the slides and examples are on there already. So feel free to you review them. And then we in the fall, we did readings in climate data science. So earlier today, I remember it was the first focus group report. There was mentioning that when you review papers, sometimes it's hard for you to pinpoint the personal perspectives on methods used, or sometimes it's very hard to unpack a paper. For young researchers, when you read the published work, then you need to understand the culture of the representation of research in papers is not the same as in textbook, right? Textbook trying to be comprehensive, but the paper you already have one narrative, and then you need to look through that narrative to learn so that you can integrate the idea into your own research. So based on that, the readings in climate data science course that Greg and I led in the fall was precisely try to create an environment where we can just talk about the papers, not just take the paper as their face value or take everything claimed in the papers for granted. We actually want to answer some dumb questions, right? I think there was another focus group point that we need to have a place where we can just feel free to ask dumb questions. So that the reading in climate data science was designed to be coupled with the LEAP lecture and LEAP seminar, so that when you listen to the presentations, you don't want to interrupt the speaker too often, or you want to have some expanded conversation about certain aspect of it, but they never feel the moment is right in the middle of seminar or even in the reception to have such conversation. So the reading in climate data science course is like a topic course for doctoral students on current literature, and we are hoping to iterate that course further to be more tight connected with ongoing research. So at the very end, the final project, the final is not project, the final is a small reading project for the student. We invite the student to focus on some of the readings and then pinpoint a few things that they think are actionable in their own research direction or something they're interested, and then try to outline their interest of potentially pursue that further. So we believe we are envisioning this as an exercise to build up community, to allow the doctoral student to know each other, but also allow them to get more out of the lecture courses, the seminars from the LEAP organizers, and also to learn how the soft skills of reading literature, the soft skills of identify questions and problems from literature. So that's the second course. The third one is the climate prediction challenges, which is actually two things. One is a course, it's project-based learning. The other is a collection of small challenges we're trying to create. I think there is a lot of appetite for challenges that can engage researchers. We start with 3 small challenges last year: hurricane predictions. We turned one of water stratification, lake temperature stratification project into a physics-informed machine learning project. And we have returned Gillen's testbed data set into a challenge on spatial temporal modeling. So those are, as all the focus group activity or the research activity going forward, I believe that this effort can move in 2 ways. One is that we will continue creating such challenges, big and small, but these challenges can be used for our own courses, but it can also be used embedded in other courses. And a lot of machine learning courses have now all university campuses include a final project. Usually students need to find their own project. They all work on sometimes the same thing. And then sometimes I feel as an instructor, how many cats versus dog prediction project I can read. Like but I always encourage my students to consider projects that inspired by university research, but it's very hard for master student, undergraduate student to identify research project out of it. So I think as a research center, what we can do is to meet the student halfway, so we don't have to fully define the research project for them, but we can unpack the science, unpack the data, get them started a little bit before, so that they can take it from there. And many of such opportunities exist. I will touch upon them later. And then everyone enjoyed the boot camps. So last May we were here. We had the very first momentum boot camps, and then we just had another one in a little bit over a week ago, or 10 days ago, and at the Teachers College Learning Theater, which everyone enjoyed both the intellectual content. The community, and also the space. So we look forward to continue doing that, and we will iterate. I took notes earlier today when the focus group talking about they want to learn advanced GISS, they want to learn Fortune. So we can discuss, and I think Ryan and Julius and the education team, we can discuss about what's possible. We will not. I'm not committing that we'll be doing all of this ourselves, but we can take a leadership of discussing what will be the best way of organizing such learning activities. And then forthcoming, so this is the first time we will talk about this in the LEAP community, that for the proposal, we're talking about a full course certificate that including a lot of background courses. And then the challenge of that operation is that has to happen not just at Columbia, but elsewhere, and need to be organized online. Then we recognize that many of those background courses, such as machine learning course or climate science course, or even computing course, already exist in nearly all institutions. So what LEAP contribute to that certificate is the final course in machine learning for environmental earth sciences, that a capstone experience, and take all the students with the right background to another next level in climate data science research. So we are in an active discussion with Columbia, a various team of trying to create such a micro credential that would allow us to support such need at scale. So those are things typically happen during the semester or very close to the semester. And LEAP we get busy during summer. So in summer, we can think of three main activities. We have the REU, and then the REU's goal is to provide research experiences for undergraduate. And the key word here is research experiences, not necessary research activity. There are differences in there, and then it took me a while to learn the differences, and it's very important to know the difference. That for our RU program, the value, the focus is to engage students in research and allow them to experience research. So the focus shouldn't be that activity they do would be super valuable for the research itself. It may, because some of our RU students, produced research results that lead to that could be later being published. But sometimes research, we all know research fail, and then so the focus should be engage them, support them to experience research so that they become interested in pursuing research after their undergraduate. It's a way of broadening participation. It's a way of building up the future, and we all have a responsibility of that. So the REU program, I have this goal. We also are envisioning the summer momentum fellows being a mechanism to engage data science doctoral students in doing a research intern. The idea needs to be mapped out more into a more concrete plan, but we believe that it's a mechanism that is more suitable for data science students who have a focusing methodology research, but they're willing to spend one summer to have an immersion. So think about this as a research immersion, that they take what they know in machine learning and then immerse themselves with a research group with a climate science research focus. And then, if they do Bayesian computation, MCMC, and we can do the matchmaking with a team. And if they do transfer learning or active learning, then for them, the goal is to really contribute to the research, learning through experience. And the idea is that they may find out whether they can contribute to research in a 3-month period, and then the outcome would be they either research fail all the time, the idea didn't work, but also the positive outcome would be they become interested, they stay engaged, become collaborators, and then integrate a climate science application as part of their dissertation. So that will be a win-win for both sides, for the hosting research group and for the students themselves. Then we heard from Oren about our Summer Institute for K-12 teachers, and I'm not going to repeat that, but call for participation are forthcoming, and I will touch upon that a little bit later. And then you're seeing a version of this in Pierre's presentation, that we really want participation from researchers in the education effort, not because we cannot, not simply because that we cannot do all of these ourselves. Like, it's not just because of short of labor that we need human resource, but because I think there are natural values. So what do we want you for? I say we want you to be your brilliant self. I want you to, everyone enjoy research. We're here because we enjoy research. We believe that we can contribute our research to solve important problems. And then when I think about education programs, I feel there is a role that research can play just being themselves. And then as a research team, as an education leadership team, is want to create mechanism and infrastructure and programming so that you come in being yourself, but you still contribute meaningfully to the education effort. So we want you to participate in things that you care about. So we have many ways that research can participate, a broadened participation, convergence between machine learning and climate data science, or creating challenges. And we have heard a lot of comments throughout these 2 days that many people care about these topics. And then if you care about it, then we can design mechanism for you to lead or participate in things in this direction that you care about, and then to have this alignment. I feel synergy and convergence is how we can effectively doing research education, not a transfer DI at the same time as a new center. And then we also want the activity to benefit your research, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. And then so search several mechanisms. I actually wrote this last night without hearing all the discussion today. So this is very much in sync with what we have discussed so far, and we would like to invite researchers to co-design prediction challenges based on your research, especially if you say sometimes I use the analogy with when I was at Data Science Institute, I say I want our research to think that they enter the candy store of machine learning. And they know other people have enjoyed the candies, and they look around, they all look very shiny, and then so you go to the top journal of your field, and not like in a candy store, and you see some of the most exciting research being driven by machine learning, and then you imagine yourself in such a store, and then you say, I want that. And then education can allow you to explore that, because you may want that, but do you really know you want that? And then I think a lot of time our internal battle is, I think I want that, but I'm not sure I can't have that. And should I stop what I'm doing? And I know, should I step out of my comfort zone and then say, I want that, and I want to have that? And that's a big decision sometimes. Education allows you to step out of your comfort zone a little bit and then at the same time contributing to education efforts. So you even if you decide that's not something I would enjoy. So I'm glad I tried, but my conclusion is that I would step back and do my Euro research business as usual, but at least you contribute to education effort, and then that's also a very effective way of learning it. I remember Gillen came to my office a few years ago, and then initially we're talking about collaborations, and we talk about one idea of the Gaussian process, and I literally just step out of my office, grab a doctoral students, and then knowing that they would do a course project, and I would just ask Gillen whether they're interested in talking to a student and start doing this project. It's a great way of co-design something. And so you can also, the machine learning instructor, if you want to, we all know that there's nothing better to learn than to teach. So if you're hosting a climate challenge, prediction challenge in your course, you will have to learn a little bit. You will read a lot of final reports about it. And then you may have a climate science student in your class if you have a reputation that your class has challenges inspired by climate science research. So machine learning instructors can learn climate science this way. Well, climate researchers, I sometimes think if you think that you already know what you want in machine learning with a weak idea, and then you are willing to work with not a big class of 500 students, you don't want to go to Carl's class and talk to the 500 students and they all rush to your office hour and want to do your project. But if you say, I'm willing to mentor one team, and I want to mentor one team to consider transfer learning, and then you have a well-defined, and our team can help you with that definition, then you can show up to Carl's class, do a five minute project pitch saying that this, and Carl can say, this, you can use all the computer vision tools. And then the idea is Carl need to grade those projects anyways, or some version or ChatGPT need to grade that anyway. So naturally the students is learning and is supported in a learning environment, but somehow you will get a taste of the research. So I think these are the ways. And then for the REO students, because the goal is to create risk experience, so we do want the people who participate in creating research project for RU students to think more long term, that we are preparing a talent pipeline. So the immediate return may not be high, but it is one of the mission of that. So we are inviting researchers to participate, but with a warning label saying that we are not giving you 5 students that will clean your data set, and that many amazing things will happen for your research, but many amazing things will happen if these 5 students decide to pursue a research career in climate data science. But for the PhD fellows, I think the immediate return could be high. So if you have a good match between your research project and the research interest of that doctoral student who is interested in doing machine immersion in your lab, and you can actually get pretty serious about what research you would like to do together. In addition, that from time to time for the summer institute for KT activities, we are hoping that researchers will participate. So what we also want to make it easy for you. I have already touched upon this. We have design studio interns who are master students who can. So one idea is that you have Python codes for your paper, and sometimes you don't want to share them because you're embarrassed by how messy they look, and you just don't want to share them because you know the moment you share them, people will email you because they cannot run them. They want you to help them. I got those emails too. So and master students are looking for research experience all the time. We have thousands of them on Columbia campus, and they are looking for research. One research activity is for them to read a paper, read your code, and create a clean, reproducible Jupyter notebook out of it. And yes, you will need to spend time with the student. You will mentor the students, but that effort will pay back when you have a clean, beautiful, Lee Pangeo ready Jupyter notebook that can save your effort and then amplify the impact of research at scale. So that's the kind of thing that it's educational because you're offering students research experience, and you may even make it fun. And we can even do a hackathon. People just think about visualizations, think about innovative way of introducing a concept of climate science to data science. A lot of these can be turned into learning activities and then leverage the energy and the curiosity of many students on campus, and at the same time can be beneficial. And the design studio, we are not saying you should be the one designing it, and I personally will be more than excited to meet with whoever have such need, have such desire to be open to the discussion, and then to show you that nearly everything we do as a researcher can be turned into learning activities. But the key is to identify the right student, the right group of learners you will be engaged with. Not every activity is appropriate for undergraduate, not activity is appropriate for a doctoral student. So identify the right learner, identify the right format. Should it be course-based? Should it be summer? Should it be an intensive hackathon? Should it be a asynchronous challenge that we create on GitHub and just broadcast them through the email newsletter? And all of these are choices we can make to design. Is that there's a human-centered design element to this. And I remember the mentioning of soft skills such as project management, communications, and then human-centered design is another thing that make you a better researcher, that also make you a better educator. So the Li Panjiu team is more than ready to discuss with you about the data and computing need if you are for both research and education, because these two are really coupled. And whenever we and the Panjiu team has been advocating for open science for years, and many of them involve education of open science practices at scale, is advocating for reproducibility. In the before LEAP proposal, there was another proposal called DIX, a data intensive geoscience. In there, we're advocating for open science, creating the innovation ecosystem that's supported by better computational practices for geoscientists. And then learning how to become better computational scientists is painful if you're doing on yourself, on your own, in your look up like Stack Overflow, Reddit, and then try to make sense of all the comments. How computer science students do it? They do it in groups. They hang out together. They complain about how confusing certain comments are. So they figure things out together. And then education is a great way to join such a community. If you're ambitious, you can join a community of 50 students. If you worry about your bandwidth, you join a community of 2 to 3, and even 2 to 3 doing things together would make it more fun and more rewarding. And then you see the growth, you see convergence. That's just byproducts of this effort to make even better. And then the education team here, I'm talking about Jihei, Charles, and I. Like Oren leads the Summer Institute, so you're the team, but I'm not tasking you or logistics. The three of us can really discuss with you of how can we be helpful with logistic application form, review applicants, identify space, ordering snacks, making announcements. Catherine is more than happy to tweet and linking everything that every excitement come out of such effort. So the most natural, the most low-hanging fruits for educational activities that can benefit research is exploration of ideas. One time I hosted a course project for OCR, optical character recognition, that some researcher was hoping to look for to evaluate algorithms that are correct for errors in OCR. And then he asked me idea. I said, I have no idea. I don't know that literature. And then I said, how can I learn? And incidentally, I was also looking for a project idea for a course I was teaching. Like we use common data framework, which means that the whole class work on the same challenge at the same time and then share ideas. So I said, how come I talked to my TA? So we review the literature very quickly, identify a bunch of papers and randomly assign the paper to teams. And then each team is tasked to evaluate a pair of algorithm for OCR error correction using a common data set we created. So if you think about that, I am interested in learning MCMC or Bayesian framework or convolution neural net or LSTM, all the things I want to learn, and I have no time it will be a very slow process for me to learn all the paper in a matter of semester. If you put in a structured education setting, you are forced to structure the problem first, and then the student go out, but then they present. When they present, you can ask difficult questions. That's why I said, show up, be your brilliant self. We all have done this. We show up to seminars, we show up to conferences, we show up to CESM defense. When we listen to the research, we think about it, and we can ask great questions and imagine how that is relevant to our research. So when you do project this way in a classroom, you show up, you don't have to prepare much, and Dylan can attest that sometimes I just ask her to show up without knowing what she will be saying. But when she working with each team, I don't think that you have a difficulty coming up with feedback to the teams. And then the team try out ideas, and then sometimes our idea will not that great, but sometimes our idea works. So that's a great way of exploration of ideas. And then for the doctor, student, and postdoc, this is also a great way of communication is when you communicate with students, you suddenly realize that you need to create multiple ways of explaining the same concept. If you're first saying climate attribution, they look like blank at you, and you need to, what I mean is that. So a lot of this is a soft skill in communication. Recruitment of talents. Different disciplines have different way of admitting doctor students. In statistics, we have a committee model, but in some discipline, you have a lab model that you recruit directly into your lab. There's no better way of learning the ability of students through educational programs. And then the third level of benefits are just the soft skills, that project management, interpretation, and translation skills. Translation skill means that you are working with people from other disciplines with a different level of technical training. And then the more you participate, the more you can benefit from that on your professional skills. And I think that was another thing is that if we go back to this one, this lineup of programs offers different way of engagement in terms of time, in terms of topic, in terms of level, right? So if all of this can be designed. So if you say, Tian, I teach semester courses, I cannot really commit to work with students in a capstone project throughout a semester, but I am curious about what they can do. You can be a judge for a hackathon. That's a one-day commitment, and that you'll learn a lot through that. I have been judged for hackathon for election, for smart city design, for gentrification. You sort of, when you listen to 10 presentations talking about why it is important and what they did and why it's you sort of learn a lot. It's really an easy way to do. And if you say, I want this to be meaningful to my own research, I'm willing to spend time 1 hour a week with a few students, and that is a mentor research, and we can set up a section. I don't know about other institutions in Columbia. Students can take full credit for mentor research, or they can be hired as research assistant. Those mechanisms can be explored. So we want. What do we want? We want you, but we don't want you to do anything that you would not want to do. We try to convince you that there are ways that you can you can be part of this. And then that's what we call education and research integration. So with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Very quick one. How do you develop the list of climate prediction challenges that are offered for that course?
So we were doing it for the first year. I basically went through the PI names and searched up their papers and read some of the latest papers. And then if the paper have a GitHub repository, I will review to see, I'm not trying to create my own challenges. I'm not going to find a paper that does not have a GitHub, does not have somebody I know. I'm just saying I want to create a project out of that. So for education, we are not focused on doing the most cutting edge. We're trying to create learning experiences. So for the research, we want them to be education integration ready. But if a researcher see the benefit and they say, I don't have a clean GitHub repository, but I want to participate, then we will need a more extensive development because they come to me, then naturally I have PI engagement already, then we will hire a design studio intern to develop that. There are two ways.
I wonder if there's any possibility for, a possibility for the multi-institutional joint class, because like you already mentioned, like every class materials from peers and yours are on like GitHub repo, so everyone can recreate in their own institution. But I think there could be benefit to bring all together. And especially, I think like teaching faculties may be able to save their time by sharing teaching load. So yeah, curious, like, yeah.
I want you to explain what do you mean by joint class?
So same class like happening at the same time, but at multiple locations.
So let me wear my department chair hat here.
Mm-hmm.
So as a department chair, if Pierre is my faculty, and he wants to teach his course and he wants to collaborate with Mike for a course in Irvine, they have decided that they're going to share lecture. Pierre teach half, Mike teach half through Zoom. And in that, I will not have objection. It's not that teaching load, is more of Pierre is fully in charge of the course and there is a syllabus. And in many courses, there are guest speakers, they're rotating things. So to me, Pierre is fully responsible of that course implementation and education evaluation at Columbia. Whether he would like to invite other instructors from other institutes to teach in his class, that's up to him to decide. Same with Mike, I believe, whatever. I think every university works this way. What is complicated, I see Eric there. What's complicated is to say you will be taking a Columbia course, right? So that will appear as a Columbia course on your transcript, and it's not impossible. It just have another administrative hurdle that you need to do you need to be admitted as a non-degree student, and you need to take, and then that need to be online. So that's why I asked, what do you mean by joint? If you mean that they will cover the lecturing, coordinate some lecturing, having some become guest lecture to each other classes, that's totally mechanism people are already using. But if you're thinking that this course is officially cross-listed between UC Irvine and Columbia, I honestly don't even know what that means.
For your presentation, I was wondering, say we have like a summer research program and we are trying to hire, say, like an undergrad or master student. I'm just curious, like what sort of support you can provide in, say, like finding the student, possibly funding them, training them, and so on.
So GK we will officially mapping that out next week, which we have a workflow. So what the workflow from the research perspective, from the researcher perspective, is that we will call for research description. So basically we want to have a call for people to contribute to the research project in terms of what you're envisioning as the long-term project, what is the short-term summer project, how the short-term project fit in the long-term project, and most importantly is that what are the learning outcomes of this experience that you think the student will benefit from, because they will ask those questions to us and we don't know how to answer on your behalf. In addition, that what are the deliverables? A student are often very curious about what are the potential deliverables of the research, whether it will be a software, visualization, papers, all of the above. And then what are the prerequisites? Like, do you prefer to have a junior, senior students, master students? What are the prerequisite skills you would like to have? So with all this information, we will list them in one place where all the project description and student submit an application and blanket application to all the projects, or to select the project. They will choose their preferences, and we will send the PIs a collection of students for them to look at, and then they will start the matchmaking. We're also partner with Amazon Shores program and also a few other similar summer RU programs. So they recruit the student first, and then they try to match with student into research group and center. So having such a collection project will also allow us to share with the administrator of the program, and they will share the project with prospective students, and they will approach us.
I had a comment and a question. The comment is, thank you so much for making these courses so portable. I recognize all the institutional barriers to getting things actually for credit, but like the fact that Pierre's course was able for UC students to audit worked seamlessly, and the demand was amazing. And so anyone who's at a different institution, we're hearing great things about this course, and spread the word. Like, it'd be great to see this take off. It's a real impact that
Right,
the SDG is having.
So the Columbia Engineering School supported the LEAP in a way that students that is part of the LEAP community can audit through the Columbia Video Network at no cost to them, right? I remember the video, you added them, right, as auditing students.
So to the extent that NSF monitors our legacy and our impact in this way, that's a quantifiable impact that is going to help our chance at renewal, and that's so wonderful. And we should make sure to sustain it. And if it's working here, think about it in the climate challenge prediction. I don't know if it's as portable or not. Some courses are, but we shouldn't make work that
we
doesn't
are.
be made.
I think my envision of making that portable is that we design the challenges. And then we're happy to engage instructors who are waiting to use them in their course. So we can do it as a group section. We can also do an office hour section that they eventually, I want to grow the collection of climate prediction challenges, almost like a candy store, and people pick it up, but they want to know how to use it, well, how to eat it. Then we can do that in a very short tutorial section. So that will make it portable.
Cool. And then the question was, can you tell us a bit more about the PhD fellowship program in the summer? How big's the pool? How are people being found?
Yeah, Pierre and I were exchanging comments. Maybe Pierre can share.
Yeah, that's still in development, but we're thinking about that as a way to also engage the machine learning community. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that later today. Stay tuned.
I also want to mention that, sometimes I have a hard time recalling how I actually feel like when I was a doctoral student. But I remember when you're a doctoral student or even as a junior faculty, you sometimes wonder what should you do, what I should be doing, like whether this is something I should be doing. I think all the PIs, all the senior faculty in this room recognize that there are competing priorities, there are values in PhD students and postdocs participating in educational activities, but at the same time, there are only so many hours in a day. And we totally understand that. So so what do we do in the LEAP education team is we encourage all the doctoral student and postdoc to consider this because there are actual benefits, but have a conversation with your advisor, with your mentor in how much and in what forms would be the best way for you to participate for your professional growth. Because there are a lot of benefits in terms of, turn you into a better communicator, turn you into a better educator, turn you into a better researcher, actually, by doing that. So there are ways that we can cover a lot of those bread and butter activities ourselves, but the researcher participation make it more amazing and wonderful. And then we can run a very boring version of everything you see, but the more participation we have from research, the more exciting and more engaging and more beneficial the program will be for our students and for our researchers. So I just want to say this to the doctoral student and postdoc in the audience that discuss this with your mentor if you're interested.
We have 1 more minute for a pressing question or comment.
Sure. I'm loving so much about how the organization of LEAP actually works. I'm really impressed. So I'm going to speak for people who are outside of LEAP. You talked about the researchers and the students within the program, but there's going to be a lot of people outside of this collaboration across the United States and in other countries who are like, what you're doing is so cool. What are your thoughts about having that impact outside of this formal organization? You may not have a student audit at Columbia, but materials are there, joining on web Zoom. Is that part of the mandate of LEAP, or is like, no, we got to focus internally?
We're building up. So a lot of effort last year was we're building up this. Everything you've seen, we build up from, I think with the exception of Pierre's course that exists before LEAP, and then some of the Pengios exist before the LEAP. A lot of things you see build up last year, and then we are hoping to create materials that can be used by anybody, including the micro-credential program. I think the mandate, we have twofold of mandate. One is that we want our education effort to support the research. We want to empower our own students, doctoral students, undergraduate students to develop a research career in climate data science. That is a very important mandate in order for what LEAP's mission to be sustainable, to contribute to a better future. The other is that what we created should be disseminated more broadly. So our bootcamp is already available to people outside, even though because it's in person, so it's geographically constrained, but it's recorded, and that recording can be used by other institutions to engage their more local community. And then we are hoping to create online video that teach machine learning, and that can be also shared in ways to engage with learners and researchers outside the immediate LEAP community.
If I may add to that, we may receive funding from a donor to actually expand more globally, especially in the developing world. Great. With that, I want to thank Tian, and please be engaged. You're very important, if you're interested. So I'll first start with the benchmarks for CSM, and first summarizing a little bit what we discussed or what I presented yesterday. So just to refresh a little bit your memory. So again, what we want to do is we want to target climate uncertainties, again, on a range of a couple of decades, typically to 2060. And again, we know that a lot of those uncertainties are coming from physical processes. So we want to actually improve that through different ways, like we want to improve metrics again, tweaking or tuning the parameters that we have in the models, and improving the closures of those different parameterizations. In the strategic plan that Gideon referred to a minute ago. So we actually again define that as different objectives. So we talk about improving parameterization, and that relates to the parameterization focus group. So we expect there that machine learning could help actually do a better job. So that was a lot of the discussions we had. We also want to automatically calibrate the ESM, and that will relate to what we will present in a minute. How do we actually benchmark that? How do we use the metrics that we have? And how do we actually evaluate progress, right? So, and that was actually part of the estimation focus group. But again, that's very, very tightly connected to the metrics. So I hope you realize that. And the last objective in terms of the related to the focus groups is to advance model evaluation. So again, developing different metrics, bringing those metrics together. And that relates back again to what Dave is going to present in a minute. So how do we actually quantify progress really and towards what goals and metrics? And in the end, we again want to get basically our new and improved projections, right? That's the ultimate goal that we have. But really the question is what and how do we define better? Okay, so that's really what Dave is going to mention.
Great, thanks. So Pierre just asked me to make this yesterday, so hopefully this is going to be suitable for this discussion. But just in case anyone doesn't know who I am, just want to make sure you understand who I am, because I think it sets the context. I'm Dave Lawrence, and I've been at NCAR for 20 years, and that whole period I've been involved in the development of CSM. Essentially my career has been all centered around CSM. I have some scientific presence, but really I feel like my legacy, if there's going to be one, is through my contributions to the CSM effort. And as such, one of my jobs was to lead the development of the land model component of CSM, but I've also been involved in other leadership aspects of CSM. And essentially, I've been in the room for most of the major decisions, most of the sausage making that's gone on in the patient of CSM for the last 2 decades. So I feel fortunate to be in that position, but I also feel like I'm trying to be a resource to the LEAP project from that perspective, having that historical knowledge. So, okay, so the thing we're going to need to do in LEAP, or we want to do really anytime we're doing model development, but in LEAP is, in particular, is to establish whether or not we've made the model better and the model projections better. Of course, it's quite hard to establish that you made a model projection better, right? Because we don't have the validation data to really assess that. We can do hindcasts, and we do that, and that may be applicable, but we are going into unknown territory with climate change. It's a harder problem, for example, than weather, where we can continually validate. So most of the time, what we do is we try to assess whether or not we've made the model better compared to historical observations, and then it's a little bit of a hope that it's going to be better in terms of projection. So in case anyone hasn't already thought through that problem before, that's what I want to say. And so, yeah, how do we assess and track progress with CSM as we make LEAP developments? And so to really kind of get there, I think it helps a little bit to understand, for me to sort of explain the process of model development that goes on. We have this sort of idealized circle that we try to follow when we're building a new model generation. And so within CSM and really all the other system models around the world, the cycle tends to be on about a 7-year time scale, which those of you who are been in the field realize it's the same time scales that IPCC reports. So we are just trying to stay far enough ahead of the next IPCC report that we can produce the next generation of big model simulations that can then support the writing of that document. So it's not scientifically driven, and you'll hear scientists complain all the time that, this is not the way you decide when to make a model version. We've tried to break out of this cycle many times. We've never successfully broken out of the cycle because funding models are built around it. So that's the cycle. So we got about 7 years to build a new model version from the time when we released the last model version. And so during that sort of 7-year cycle, and LEAP is going to try to insert itself into that 7-year cycle. So we had our model release, CSM2, that was like 3 or 4 years ago now. What happens subsequent to that is we do these big integrations. They're all out there for the community to review and evaluate. And the community does that. They go, they assess the models, they identify the weaknesses, hopefully the strengths sometimes. Weaknesses is what people like to focus on, which is fine, that's great. And then they try to say, how can we make the model better? So they come back through our working group structure and propose new parameterizations, like what LEAP is going to do, or new features to add for new processes that you want to represent in the system. The working group will then review those and consider them. These ideas are presented at working group meetings. Obviously, we want published work to rely on, so people try to publish papers. We try to encourage people to publish papers on the work. In this case, what LEAP is trying to do is get into this part of the process with new LEAP machine learning inspired algorithms that can change the game. And so here's what I want to advertise. I've spoken to a bunch of you already at this meeting, but the twice annual working group meetings that we have within the CSM project, where really is the opportunity to learn what's going on across the whole modeling project. In the summer meeting, we get 350, 400 people. So this is a big project. And LEAP is a big project as well. So LEAP can actually make a demonstrable difference to the overall effort, but really only if we show up to those meetings, because people who don't show up to those meetings, it's not like it's the rule. If you don't show up, you don't get your stuff integrated into the model. But effectively, the people who show up to these meetings and present and argue their case for why this model improvement needs to be made are the activities that tend to get integrated. So our next set of meetings is coming up in I think the atmosphere model working group starts in a week and a half. And registration is open. It's really open to anyone. We never say anyone can't come. Almost every working group has an open call for talks. We try to accept everyone who wants to give a presentation. It's really an opportunity to share what you're doing. And as much as that is to learn what everyone else across the community is doing, to see how it intersects so that we don't duplicate effort. You see synergies, you see collaboration opportunities. So I really encourage everybody to attend. It's hybrid, so you can come in person. We love that. It's going to be really fun, as we saw in this meeting, to be talking to people in person, but we are going to maintain a hybrid component here and going forward. Okay, so that's part of the process. You kind of get involved in these working group meetings, have a new ML guided algorithm. Usually we're actually getting close to the stage where 3 or 4 or 5 years into the development cycle, we start trying to really pull it all together. So if there's 15 to 20 different projects where people are trying to advance the model, we say, okay, we're going to try now at NCAR to bring this all together and start doing these new simulations to understand whether or not the model has gotten better, where it's gotten worse, where we need to spend a little bit more time evaluating things. Sometimes it's done as a big collection of model developments, all done together. Sometimes it's done one-off. It all depends on how much time we have, how big a change that we're making. And so then it's at that stage when we start to evaluate the model, how it's doing. So often it's at the component model stage where maybe you had an addition, in this case, an example coming from the lab model. So we want to say, how is the model doing compared to the prior versions? And so what's happened in the last 5 years or so, or maybe a little bit longer than that, is there's a lot more standardized metrics packages, we call them, that allow you to evaluate the models in a systematic way. I like to sort of tell a story because for new people coming in, you say, well, this is so obvious. Why haven't you been doing this forever? The thing is, the amount of Earth observations we have now compared to like even a decade ago is really, it's almost unfathomable. I remember sitting in meetings back when I was helping develop CLM4, the Community Land Model version 4 for CSM, CCSM4 and CSM1. So it's about 10 to 12 years ago. We would run it through our diagnostics package, which all it did was make plots of everything, not compared to any observations, because there were virtually no observations of land surface quantities that we wanted. So we would sit around in a group in a meeting and say, look at gross primary productivity, the most important quantity for the carbon cycle on land. And we look at the map and we go, looks pretty good. What do you guys think? And that was the decision. We go, some would say, nobody would say anything. Someone would say, well, it looks a little high in the tropics. And you go, why do you say that? Like, it just feels like it. So, I'm a little bit exaggerating, but really there was very little data, even like a decade ago. And now we have these huge arrays of data sets. And this package a project that I've been involved in, sponsored by DOE, has put together, a metrics package that involves 35 variables, 90 plus global, regional, and site level data sets, which we can then evaluate, just like that. And it takes about 2 hours for the package to run. So the change is really been episodic, and that's kind of where LEAP is riding this wave of new observations. So here's just an example of showing CLM4, 4.5, and 5, and red just indicates the model performance is worse for this range of different metrics. There's a huge amount of information that's embedded down below this, and it's an interactive website when you run this online. And what you see is it's gone mostly from red to green, which is a good sign that the model has improved when you're evaluating all these different quantities. So that's one way we try to evaluate these models, with these big standardized metric packages. And then it's like, so then that kind of will happen. Each working group and model component will kind of be doing this process, sort of continually over the period of 3 to 4 years. And then at about 2 years before we want to release the model, we try to bring all the components together and try to evaluate what happens in the fully coupled system. And so we're actually starting that process now within trying to work towards CSM3. And that's where we try to finalize the component model. We try to identify the problems that we're having in the coupled model system. This is where we would do automated calibration if we build in the capabilities to do automated calibration. And then we also we'll do simulations to support the release of it with document the model. We try to run a bunch of different control simulations so the community has confidence that we've produced a model that is viable. In terms of LEAP, the idea here is that, if we get some LEAP activities into this development cycle or the next development cycle, as with anything we put in the model, there's switches. And so I have this here as risk mitigation because, the CSM community is still nervous about taking on machine learning based parameterization. So we need the ability to switch things on and off really easily. And if we find we don't get agreement across enough of the CSM community, then we can turn it off, but still have it there as a research tool, right? So we have that capability. This is really where NCAR is going to need to take the lead on this activity because it does require having a large number of experts in the room to discuss all the challenges. Okay, and that's why I said the Bayesian parameter as mentioned again. Okay, so what do we have now? So we're going to try to get towards this discussion this afternoon about what we can possibly do to establish whether or not the LEAP activities are making an improvement. It is still a little bit of a Wild West. I know at NCAR that's the way. I'm always curious to hear what's happening in other modeling centers, but it's not like we say, this is our set of things. You might like, a standard, like if you're going to the moon, you would have a standard list of things that you're ticking off. It's not like that. It's much more arty than that. We have a lot of packages. We run them semi-regularly, but not all the time. We have people look at them semi-regularly, but not all the time. Each one of these packages will produce thousands to tens of thousands of plots. So how do you evaluate whether or not the model's good? Nobody can look through it all. So everyone picks their favorite things and look at it. So we get together and we say, we're going to run all these diagnostic packages that we have and try to establish whether the model is okay. And really that's often the barrier, the bar that we're trying to get above is it okay? The first thing we do is we say, is the sea ice a reasonable level so that we'll actually see some sea ice decline? Does ENSO look like even quasi-reasonable, not an amplitude that's 6 times too large? We'll ask about the top of our energy budget and ask is, are we balanced? Is the thermal haline circulation, the MOC, in the right ballpark? Those are the first questions we ask, where we get past that bar, and then we kind of go to these packages and say how the model is doing. And really, if the model's not doing well, at that point in the game, there's not tons that we can do. We might do a little bit of calibration, hand tuning, like Pierre has mentioned, which is not very satisfying. We're hoping that LEAP will be able to make us not be able to do that. But there's less tuning actually that goes on than I think maybe a lot of people actually anticipate. A lot of it is you try to build good models, couple them together, and then see how it works. But here is one thing we were doing during the development cycle of CSM2. John Fasulo at NCAR had built this package called the Climate Model Assessment Tool, which is similar in some ways to this tool built in Europe called the ESM-BAL tool. You won't be able to see any of this, but basically it's another color-coded thing where on the y-axis there is different variables, big, large-scale variables that we want to track, like precipitation, temperature, winds, gradients, ENSO diagnostics. And then on the bottom is actually, in this case, it's showing all the different Earth system models. When we were developing the model, we were just showing CSM comparisons from model simulation to model simulation. And what you see here is you can then, track which variables if the model is doing well, and also whether or not through time or across different models we're doing well. In this case, and I'm always cautious to say this, CSM is a good model. It starts off from a pretty good base. In this case, it's the different model versions of CSM are towards the left there, which is among the better models. Doesn't mean this model is perfect by any stretch, and doesn't mean it's going to be better at everything. But in a synthesized way, it's among the better models in the world, which is a good starting point for LEAP coming on. So we have these different packages. We run them and try to use them to evaluate the model. Okay, so just in the last few minutes here, I want some ideas to sort of spur our discussion this afternoon. How can LEAP advance the science versus the model evaluation, which helps us answer this question about how can we track LEAP's progress. Some initial ideas I have. One is, it'd be great if some people here in LEAP learn how to utilize and hopefully enhance existing metrics packages. These are all open source packages at this point. You can run them on your own machine or on Cheyenne or the Retro supercomputers at NCAR. I often try to get grad students or postdocs who work with me to run through it because it's really like a richer way to even just understand the model, right? Just poking through plots after plot, not having to build all that, infrastructure to look at all the different fields in the model. Hopefully Leap can develop new metrics that evaluate model performance for quantities that are important to Leap, especially those focused on adaptation. So a lot of the existing packages, the emphasis is on like large scale features of the climate system. What is the temperature, mean temperature, seasonal mean temperature? What is the precipitation? What are the wind speeds of the upper atmosphere? Do you have a QPO? But isn't as much emphasis on the things that actually, are affecting humans or ecosystems. So evaluation of heat extremes is actually relatively rarely done. Precipitation intensity distribution, we do that sometimes, but it's not always a standard metric. Study drought and flood, crop growing season length, things like that. So Leap, I think, can come in here and try to help out here and develop metrics so we can then integrate into these packages so we're tracking these things going forward, the things that really matter. And I just want to give an example of, I think, a nice example of, it's like cherry picking from my own research, but of an example of a project where we're trying to evaluate, trying to understand whether or not you can use Earth system models to predict water availability on land in rivers. And so what this shows is the question you want to have is we know climate change is going to happen. With that climate change, there's going to almost certainly going to be a change in temperature. There may be an increase or a decrease in precipitation depending on where you are. And so we can observe using interannual variability, how does the Colorado River respond to a 1 degree increase in temperature, a 1 degree decrease in temperature? How does it respond to a 10% increase in precipitation or 10% decrease in precipitation? And then you say that's what we want the models to reproduce. How do the models do it that? So what you see here is that this is, I'll show each circle there and the circle around it is from a different Earth system model from actually CMIP5, the previous generation of CMIP. What we see is that there's a few models that are kind of capturing that relationship correctly, but the majority of them are not getting it right. So then you would say, well, should I really be using, stream flow information that's coming out of the Earth system model to do my impacts research? And the answer to that would probably be no. If all the models were lying there at the center of that dot, then you say, okay, I can probably have some confidence in that. So that's kind of an impacts relevant metric. You can assign a number to this to see how good the model is. Other things we can do is develop new process-oriented metrics for Leap targeted processes. I think this is something that Leap can really focus in on. If we're going to advance a parameterization, you can ask the question, what are the key features of the model that are going to advance that I can test directly, related to that parameterization? That's like an important step that Leap can do before we kind of get back to ask these bigger questions about did the temperature patterns get better? Did the precipitations patterns get better? The question is, did we make the cloud microphysics better? And does that improve a cloud or whatever simulation? That's an important question. So we need to develop process-oriented metrics. And here's an example of what I think is a good process-oriented metric. This is capturing snow insolation. And so the way you read this curve here is that on the x-axis is snow depth. It's called effective snow depth here. I don't need to explain what that is. And now on the y-axis is a measure of the insolation. So a low value means there's low insolation. So when there's no snow, the soil temperature ends up being pretty close to the atmospheric temperature as you expect. As you get more and more snow, snow provides insulation. So the ground temperature is going to be quite a bit warmer than the atmospheric temperature in winter. And so there's a Russian data set where they've tracked this for a couple of decades over many hundreds of sites in Russia. And so you can build that gray and the black line there is what the observed relationship is between snow depth and insolation. And then you can see what all the models are doing. What you see is there's only 2 or 3 models which are actually getting that snow insolation relationship right. Most of the models are doing a pretty poor job. So it's an example of a metric that really captures just that one process, snow insulation of the soil. And actually, there's quite a few processes in the snow that lead to that, but still, it's kind of zeroing in on one thing. I think that's all I want to say, except for the one last thing is that we can also develop new ML-based observational data sets. So the work that Galen was talking about with the PCO2, and there should be other opportunities for that where there's sparse data, but we want to evaluate a global model with it. We can use ML to develop these new data sets that can then get integrated into these analysis packages. So I will stop there. Thanks. Oh yeah, I was supposed to do this slide too. I forgot. Pierre added it. We're also starting to plan towards computing for LEAP. And one of the things we can do within LEAP is to apply for the large allocations on the NCAR supercomputers, Cheyenne and coming in June to Derecho. And so that allocation request, it's available twice per year. And in general, these things get granted at some level. We will get some resources if we apply for it. That needs to be led by somebody outside of NCAR. So I think the idea here is that we are going to start trying over the next month or so to collect information about what computing needs people have as we run up to a March allocation request. And so initially, let's run some of that discussion through Wayne, our new integration engineer. And if Wayne has questions about how to deal with it, then he can work with me to figure out how that allocation works. Right. This is for my understanding, 2ITC is mostly built for analysis. The computational resources are mostly there to do analysis and model integrations. The big integrations you're going to need to do if you're running with CSM can't be done within the 2I2C framework currently. And so this is for ability to access the large computations you need to do Earth system model simulations.
Yeah, I'll go since I interrupted things. I really like what you're saying about the diagnostics packages and like getting people familiar with the diagnostics. I feel like this aligns with a lot of different things we're trying to do in LEAP. It's a great way to understand what modeling centers care about, what are the important variables, what do people look at. The perspective I have from someone who's worked very hard on developing like general purpose analysis software is that sometimes I feel like the diagnostics frameworks just live in their own, monolithic world. Like, I guess I'm talking mostly about ESM Val tool, which is the one I know the most. But whenever I've looked at it, it's like this has nothing to do with my like normal Python workflow. Like the process for doing that, it feels so intimidating and like a lot of work to learn to use. And here we were talking about education. How do we teach people about the tools? So like we can teach people about using those tools, but I'm also curious to hear your take on whether there's a effort or maybe some of those other packages you mentioned that are more interoperable and sort of modular in such a way that we could just like bring in components of those functions without necessarily having to like use the full end-to-end framework. And like to be real specific, like a lot of them assume you've got files, like netcdf files on a disk. And like here we've got like Zara data in the cloud. So often it's just like, well, we're stuck, like it doesn't work at all. There's no way to even move forward.
Yeah, it's a really excellent point. And we obviously recognize this. This is a topic of conversation all the time. These packages are so big at the moment that it's hard to convert them into something that's a little bit more flexible. We would love to do it. And if LEAP like has a motivation to help us transition towards that, right? We would totally be up for it. There's a recognition, that the world is moving towards this like on the fly ability to just get data from anywhere. And this is not built like that. Just like the Earth system model itself, these things have legacies that are big, that are hard to sort of like redirect really quickly. So it's on our radar, but we don't have like a clear plan. It takes money. It takes a ton of money, right, to do that.
Maybe a larger discussion we could have, kind of align with what we are doing with Carbon Plan as well, but involving the whole community as well. That could really help. Maybe at AGU could be an opportunity.
Dave, so at GISS, we're trying to more systematically use single column model experiments for both in the parameter estimation sense to constrain parameter, the state space, as well as for routine evaluation of processes. Is that an effort that goes on at NCAR?
We definitely have a single column model, and we use it whether we're getting to the stage where we're like using it systematically to make decisions about our model parameterizations. I would say it's more case by case. Like it's not like we say we definitely go to single column model first and then we go to global. It's more like for a specific project, they might say that single column model is the appropriate place to do your development, and then it goes to global. But it's not like we have a systematic decision that always go that way. But we do use it. Yeah. And that is another, as you sort of mentioned yesterday, it's a great opportunity to get involved without this big computational expense. If you're just getting used to running atmosphere models, running the the full atmosphere model, it costs a lot of money. It takes a long time. Single column model runs like that. So. Not hundreds, I don't think. I think it's in the tens, yeah, tens of millions, yeah. Yeah, I don't usually do this myself because we have our own allocation process for the CSM project. Right, if it ends up being limiting because you're only putting one in, that's not good either. But I think we can evaluate that going forward. If we're running up against that problem, we could even go to Sizzle and say, here's our situation, and they would potentially listen to us. It's a big enough project that they could bend the rules potentially, but we'll kind of deal with that problem if we come across it.
Okay, so the second breakout session we'll have will be on knowledge transfer, and really trying to connect the dots between what we've seen in terms of research, education, and all the way to knowledge transfer. And as Courtney mentioned earlier, so we are really seeing that as being integrated, so the education component, knowledge transfer, and DEI. So that's really what we've been trying to achieve. So I hope you got a taste of that over the last 2 days, that LEAP is more than just research, right? There's a big educational component, there's a big knowledge transfer component, and the data infrastructure is actually trying to support all of that at once, right? That's really at the very core of what we are trying to do here. And I just wanted to maybe mention that because we haven't talked too much about that, but that those are some of the objectives that we have specifically on the knowledge transfer side from the strategic plan. So a lot of that related to bidirectional knowledge transfer, and you got a taste of that yesterday. So the first objective being trying to solicit input from multiple corporate and public stakeholders on really important and relevant climate metrics, right? So that's what we are trying to do, like trying to not just be the scientists providing data and providing information to the stakeholders, but also trying to gather some of that. And they mentioned some examples. Can we have like impact-driven metrics as well, as opposed to just the sciencey metrics that we have? The second one being to disseminate LEAP information to multiple corporate and public stakeholders. So we got a taste of that as well from Vanessa. We talked about that also with Courtney yesterday. And then also to increase the utility. So I hope you got a sense of that as well from Carbon Plan in particular, that we are trying to really increase the understanding of the importance of reliable data and trying to see how people can actually use that in their companies in particular. And then the last point being that we also want to make all LEAP research and existing, for instance, and we got that from Julius, like existing CMIP6 data, in particular open source and broadly accessible. And you saw that, I mean, now that the barrier has really been lowered in terms of using that data and starting to potentially do some interesting science with the data that we have and providing that to a broad range of stakeholders. So we see that as really this inclusivity I was mentioning earlier. So really, and again, the data infrastructure is really critical for all of those pieces. So to get back just to connecting the dots, so that's going to be the breakout session. And we see that as really knowledge transfer in terms of translation and convergence. So that's what we will try to address in that particular knowledge transfer, in that particular breakout session, sorry. And I want to emphasize that this breakout session is not just for people on the knowledge transfer side. So please, the scientists in the room, attend that particular breakout session. So we don't want to have only people in the CESM benchmark session. We also want to have people that are actually trying to connect the dots. So if you're interested in that, please join that. And there's this quote that's actually Courtney used quite a few times, so we're thinking of translation in terms of external knowledge transfer and internal knowledge transfer, right? So, and the external one is actually very much related to this quote from Manabi at the time. And so in a nutshell, he was saying that understanding climate change, and also he was talking about predicting climate change, is really difficult. But the most difficult part is actually related to politics and society, at the end of the day. So how do you actually translate that, make use of the data, make sure that people can actually use this information in the end? And so we really see that as being a key role for the knowledge transfer, especially the external part of LEAP, so it's not about just creating the best science, but also making sure that this goes in the hands of the people. And we also see that in terms of internal translation. So again, in the breakout session, try to think about those two aspects, external and internal translation. And again, very much related to the fact that we have potential barriers, across disciplines, between the machine learning and the data scientists on the one hand, and the climate scientists, but also across climate science disciplines as well, right? And really, that's what we want to do. And we want to basically assess, especially pre-meeting and post-meeting, like how are we doing in terms of translation? Can people understand what we are doing across disciplines within the climate science disciplines? And can they get that across disciplines between machine learning and the climate science? So try to address that within the breakout sessions, try to get a sense as to whether we are doing a good job and we can understand each other, right? We are a very diverse group, which is great, but we also want to make sure we can collaborate and we can create synergies across, right? So it requires some level of convergence and again, of humility and translation. And that's really how we believe we can connect the dots here. And that's again, the fact that we are across many different components. You know, I showed that picture yesterday. So we are covering, you know, atmosphere, ocean, land and ice, you know, cryosphere for the climate science, but we're also covering data science. And we also have many different levels of maturity as well. So some people are very confident with machine learning. They can use the wording or the vocabulary, but some people are just getting started, right? So make sure you actually understand each other. Make sure you're trying to be inclusive when you talk to people because they might not have that understanding right now. Okay, so make sure you do. We can create that. And there was a key thing that came up, you know, especially over the last year, I would say, since we started, is that building convergence is not a symmetric road, right? And the way we were framing that, and that's at least, I mean, that could be what you could gather from that particular picture. It sounds that it's symmetric in a sense, but we are really feeling more and more that it's actually not a symmetric road, right? So there's a lot of appetite to actually use machine learning across disciplines, right? And climate science is not different from that. But also machine learning scientists in particular are in very high demand, and I'm sure Carl could speak to that, which means also that they have very limited time and also potentially interest in actually learning the domain knowledge that we have. And so climate science is just going to be, for a lot of them, just one of the applications that they have, right? So we really need to bridge that gap. So we need to actually go their way and try to find mechanisms by which we can actually facilitate that bidirectional knowledge transfer, right? So that convergence in between. So that's, I think, one of the main challenges that we are going to face moving forward, and that's something we need to address as a community. So try to think about that in the breakout sessions. And again, ideas are very welcome here. A couple of things we are trying to do for that is trying to, again, to lower the barrier. So we talked about all of the data infrastructure that we have, so we can potentially make things much, much easier. So you could actually use a climate data set. Julius showed you that, as opposed to ImageNet, right? So it seems that we're almost there, right? I mean, we are very, very close to that. But we also need to actually define benchmarks, right? I mean, that's really how we can define a machine learning problem in particular, is having very clear benchmarks and things that we can do. And I'm going to show you an example in a minute. And again, we can leverage a lot of the LeapNGeo platform that we have right now to actually include that community. And we discussed a lot of that as well in the focus groups. And Robert, you mentioned some of that. That could be one of the potential outcomes as well of the focus group. So try to think about those things, like how can we actually get those people more involved? How can we actually bring them our way? We are trying to facilitate those things. So we are also trying to put resources towards you, you know, like to actually help. We have the Convergence luncheon that I mentioned yesterday to actually help between advisor and advisees across disciplines, right? So we can actually present problems in a relatively welcoming setup. We will have the summer PhD fellowship program for 3 months, so we can actually support especially data scientists or machine learning PhD students that would want to apply their skill set to a particular climate problem, right? So that's really what we would want to do in the end. And we would love to hear from you also in terms of the suggestions, you know, and either now or on Slack, but also try to think about that during the breakout sessions, right? How can we actually get the machine learning community more involved in terms of Leap and making sure that they can actually help us? And I just wanted to mention one thing. So that's one thing I've been using in my class, but that I found particularly useful is this benchmark data set, which is called Climate Bench. Started as a community of users. Actually, Kara has been also involved in a couple of them as well. But that's really lowered the barrier, right? So you have a bunch of benchmark data sets, a bunch of different models that you can use. It's a very well organized and structured data set. We can actually even lower the bar. We actually tried that during the bootcamp with Julius. We can actually even do and use the data on the cloud using LeapNGeo. But those are things that are very useful because then we have very clear benchmarks and we know what success means, right? So those are things we would want to do through potentially the different focus groups. And this can lead to papers, right? That was a paper that was actually driven as a community. So that could be the hope for the focus groups to have a few of those data sets and those benchmarks that hopefully will be cited also widely in the future. So I think that's all I had for that. And then we can basically, I don't know if people have any questions, and then we can go into the different breakout sessions. Thanks. Okay, so let's get back to the final round of this meeting. So we will have the summary of the breakout sessions, and I don't know who wants to get started between the events. Courtney is eating. Why don't you go, Dave?
Okay, so I didn't have any time to prepare slides, so I'm just going to try to go off of memory of the dominant themes of our discussion, which was very wide-ranging. I think it was fun just for people to think about how we evaluate nerve system model. So the themes that I recall during the discussion, the first one is actually not benchmarking CSM, but I think is an important one that came up quite a bit, is ease of use. That we could use that as a metric for LEAP. If LEAP can contribute in some way or ways to make the model easier to use, more accessible to a wider group of people. That came up several times, that potentially through the parameter estimation efforts, I think that's one way that we can, come up with more rapidly come up with a usable model. But also there's probably use cases. There was at least one person who said that they've been to the CSM tutorial, taken the tutorial, and come out of that not really understanding how to use the model, which is totally normal. So we need to make sure that everyone understands that that's totally normal. But then also trying to give up situations where we can explain, creative and productive uses of the model to get people started. So, maybe we can add that into our sort of LEAP long-term plans about ease of use. In terms of actual benchmarks for evaluating Earth system models, we spent a decent amount of time discussing, what would be new. Like, we have these metrics packages that already exist. They can be used. Obviously, Ryan was suggesting they could be modernized to be more flexible, but that could be a LEAP activity, but maybe not the way LEAP's want to invest its money. But instead to do this thing where we focus in on metrics that are related to, directly related to adaptation. So extremes, drought, like I suggested, heat waves and things like that. And so Ryan was suggesting, doing this thing where we put together our top 10 metrics, come up with a number, even if it's not really super scientifically validated, but still have that as a sort of a signature thing coming out of LEAP. So I think it's worth considering, right? There are the limitations of if you're doing that, but also through the gas and power, especially when trying to communicate with people outside of our field, trying to understand it. So that's one theme. Two other themes that sort of came up that I can recall is this parameter estimation, and can we, get to the point where we can come up with reasonable parameter sets for the fully coupled system, and then be able to run, ensembles of simulations with parameter sets to get an understanding of uncertainty related to parameter uncertainty, which is essentially, we haven't done that in the Earth system modeling community at all yet, but we know it's an important part, potentially a really big part of our total uncertainty. And so I think that it's a hard project to do actually because of computational constraints, but it could be a LEAP stretch goal for maybe almost on the 10 time scale. And then the last topic that resonated with me, and I invite anyone else to really chime in here, was suggestion by Greg, which was that we are making this assumption that if we build a good model for present day conditions, that it's useful for projection. But that if you actually go and probe the CEMA5 and the CEMA6 archive and look at the quality of your simulation and then compare it to the projections that it's giving, you're not seeing constraints necessarily, if I'm getting this right, on ECS that is related to a variety of fields within your model that might be simulated well or not well. So that does raise some concern that just building a better model, whether it's actually give you a better projection. And so Greg's suggestion, if I'm getting it right, is to probe the CEMA5 and the CEMA6 data sets and look for relationships using machine learning, which can then probe this really fully, relationships between mean fields or important other features of the model, and then the impacts oriented things that we're trying to predict, and seeing if there's something in there that we should be targeting for model improvement that would really have an impact. So I thought that was a pretty good idea that we could explore going forward. So those are the four themes that I remembered. Anyone else have another big one?
Okay, so for context, the KT session, we were imagining all the scientists would be in the CESM, and it would just be us having a fun little exercise, trying to make connections and make sense out of all the science that we've seen. But thankfully, Pierre hyped up our session, and so many of you came to join us, and we're so appreciative. So it really turned into a combination of the KT team reflecting on what they were taking away from these sessions, and there's been some really meaningful gains and engagements for us since we've been here. And also the scientists talking to us about what's interesting to them, what they need, and also what they've been learning over the course of the past couple of days. So a quick summary of all of that. So from the KT side, lots of people really liked Johnny's Aichi talk. It was one of the things that we understood best. We used it as an example to say, this is what we think we're taking away from what you said, and we weren't too far off. And so that was a good example of being able to clarify something that's fairly complicated, although I know it was a much simplified version. What is clearer now is how your different projects fit into the broader LEAP strategic plan. The LEAP strategic plan is also clearer to us. So those challenges, what it is that we're trying to do. Listen, we've been hearing this for 3 years now, and we're just getting to the point like, oh, that's what we're doing. So we're getting to a point where that's clear, but partly what's supporting that are your projects as practical examples of what the challenges are. And this meeting sort of created some of those connections from us. There's a comment about the need to chunk and find the chunks of your work. So creating chunks to help you communicate key pieces of your work without having to convey all of the details, and thinking about ways that the KT team can be useful in thinking about that. And we know not all of this is relevant right now, but this is helpful for us to engage in it from earlier stages. And then on the science side, there was an expression of a deep fear as it relates to knowledge transfer, that people just won't care, that you're doing all of this work and 50% of the general public will still believe whatever it is that they believe. And so that's disheartening. There are how do you improve the way people respond to science? And so there was some discussion around that. And there was these reflections on very concrete examples that some of the scientists had in terms of when people are able to understand it and interact with it using the example of AI, they're likely to have more trust in it. And also if they're able to imagine how it has specific impacts on their lives, things that are proximal to them, that seems to build more trust. What's missing seems to be science communication, public speaking, public engagement types of preparation. That's something that some of the senior scientists were identifying that they just had to wing it and figure it out over the course of their careers. And we're trying to not have our junior scholars and senior scholars have to do that. That's what we're here to try and help support you in. And then another scientist provided an example, this was from Mike, an example of speaking to a stakeholder provided really interesting insight about something very practical that they are equipped to do, specifically related to data visualization, that was inspiring and useful. So it was an example of another thing that we're trying to set up, opportunities to speak to different stakeholders, get a sense of what they care about, what they're interested in, what questions are important to them, what kinds of data they're interested in using or engaging with, in ways in which that may potentially or not shape what we're doing on the science side. So this has been great, and thank you all for joining us.
We are a little bit ahead of time, so I'm going to get into some concluding remarks. So I first of all wanted to thank you, all of you to be joining, and I think I really love to see how sincerely engaged you were. I think throughout the days, especially you went to the poster sessions, to the knowledge transfer, DEI. We could see a lot of an education component. We could see a lot of engagement throughout the different activities from LEAP, and not just the research, right? So I think we're really starting to create something, to create a community, which is really fantastic to see. Personally, I thought that was a great success. So, and I hope that you share the same feeling that I do. I also hope that now you realize and you got a sense that LEAP is more than just research, right? So the knowledge transfer, the education, and the DEI are really important pieces of LEAP. And we really want to get you engaged, so feel free to contribute. So Tian was actually mentioning, if you want to get engaged on the education component, please reach out. If you want to get engaged on the knowledge transfer or DEI, please reach out. We are really looking for people, and we are always, that would be great to get your contribution. I wanted to just say that, when we started that was back in 2019, I was like in my office and I had a lot of stuff. I was telling the story that, I had a lot of things at the time, and I would say, okay, let's do that. I'm sure that's going to work. And, long story short, so we had a pre-proposal, a couple of like site visits, et cetera. So pretty much a roller coaster in terms of drama, like joys and then stress. And then we didn't know, will we get funded and stuff. But at the end of the day, a lot of that we were kind of dreaming, and we said, maybe that will actually be happening. And that would be a great thing to do, for the community in terms of having an impact. At the time, I think we were a couple thinking that, the planets were aligned. I mean, we had pretty much everything in place, AI, we had the data infrastructure, we had a couple of people in the room, and a lot of interest as well in terms of the impact of climate change. And I think, over the last 2 days, it was great to actually start crystallizing that and then seeing that actually the dream is actually coming true, right? So that was fantastic, at least for me to actually that. And also showing that together we can have actually more impact, and really that connecting the dots is also a way for us to be together and to us be more than the sum of our parts, So to me, that was actually quite a moment to actually witness that over the last 2 days. I think we've shown that we will be successful, I'm sure. I think we can work together. We can see that we are interested in a couple of items, not just, again, research, but we want to really have an impact in the world. And I think we've been quite successful. We've created a community. So again, what we wanted to do in this meeting, so we wanted to create a community. So I think, we were trying to converge. I think some of that we are trying to do, yeah. So, and we are trying to get some success here across many disciplines and across different activities. And I think also trying to think about impact, how can we actually communicate? How can we translate the science that we do to a broad range of stakeholders? So I think we're really getting started, but it's already quite exciting, I would say, at least from my personal perspective, So I can't wait to actually see the outcomes that come out of LEAP and to really see the legacy. I can see a lot of younger people in the room, and I just can't wait to see where you'll end up in 5 or 10 years from now. So that's going to be really, really exciting. So I want to thank you all for joining, and I'll see you next year. And in the meantime, I wanted to also thank Erin, Catherine, and GA for the very smooth and super organized meeting. Yeah, it's been truly fantastic. We've seen a lot of LEAP logos everywhere. That was awesome to see, and we have our mugs finally. And I also wanted to thank Galen and the executive committee for the great agenda that they put together. I think it went really, really well. We could see a lot of the pieces connecting all together. So that's required quite a bit of work. A lot of those things make an event really successful. Thanks to all of you.